My name is Rebecca Hale, and for most of my adult life, I believed I understood exactly how my story was going to end. I was 46 years old, married to a good man named Mark for 22 years, and I had spent 2 decades building a career as a forensic accountant, the kind of woman who reconciles other people's chaos for a living and then goes home to a life that, on the surface, needed no reconciling at all. I want to tell you this story because I think a lot of you watching will recognize pieces of it. Maybe not the specifics, maybe not the dollar amounts or the woman at the center of it, but the feeling, the slow realization that someone you loved, someone who raised you, could be erased from your life by another person's greed. That feeling, I think, is universal. And if you've lived through something like it, I want you to know, you are not crazy, you are not bitter, and you are not wrong for wanting the truth. I grew up in a modest brick house in a town outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knew whose porch light was still on past 10 and whose lawn needed mowing. My father, Walter Prescott, built a small hardware and lumber business from nothing. Prescott Building Supply, 3 locations by the time I graduated high school, a name that meant something to contractors across 3 counties. My mother, Diane, kept the books for the company for years before her illness made that impossible, and even after she stopped working, she remained the quiet center of gravity that held our family together. I was the oldest of 3. My brother Daniel came 2 years after me, and my sister Kimberly 6 years after that. We were not a wealthy family in the way people picture wealth now, but we were comfortable. And more than that, we were secure. My father's word was his signature. Men shook his hand on deals worth more than his house, and never once worried he'd go back on it. That was the man I knew as my father, steady, plain-spoken, generous almost to a fault. The kind of man who'd quietly pay off a struggling employee's medical bill and never mention it to anyone, including his own family. I tell you all of this not because it matters what kind of business he ran or how much money there eventually was. I tell you because I need you to understand who he was before I tell you what was done to him, and to us, in the last years of his life. Because what happened wasn't really about money in the end. It was about a woman erasing a good man's legacy and rewriting it in her own name while he was still breathing. And none of us saw it happening until it was almost too late. My mother died when I was 31. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed late, gone within 14 months. I remember that year in fragments, the smell of the hospital, my father's hands shaking as he signed forms he didn't understand, the way he sat by her bed every single night after the store closed and read to her from books she'd loved as a girl, even after she could no longer respond. After she died, my father changed in a way that worried all 3 of us. He was 62, still sharp, still capable of running his business with the same steady hand he always had, but something in him had gone quiet. He'd call me some evenings just to talk about nothing, the weather, a customer who'd tried to haggle him down on lumber prices, a rerun he'd watched the night before. I understood even then that he was lonely in a way none of us could fully fix. Grief does that. It carves out a space that children, even loving ones, can't quite fill. For almost 4 years, my father lived alone in the house he'd shared with my mother for 36 years. He kept her reading glasses on the nightstand. He kept her garden alive, badly, stubbornly, refusing to let the roses die even though he had no talent for it. Danny and I took turns having him over for Sunday dinners. Kimberly, who lived 2 states away by then with her husband and kids, called him every week without fail. I want to be honest with you about something. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if our love, real as it was, wasn't enough to fill the hole my mother left. I wonder if that's part of why what happened next was even possible. Not because we didn't care enough. We did. More than words can really carry. But because a man in his mid-60s who has lost the love of his life is, in a very particular and painful way, vulnerable. And there are people in this world who can smell that vulnerability the way a shark smells blood in water. Her name was Vanessa Colton, and she came into our lives at a Rotary Club fundraiser dinner my father almost didn't attend. I remember exactly when my father first mentioned her. It was a Sunday in early October, and he'd brought a bottle of wine to dinner instead of his usual six-pack of beer, which should have tipped me off immediately that something had shifted. "I met a woman," he said, almost sheepishly, like a teenager confessing a crush. "At the Rotary dinner. Her name's Vanessa. She does event planning, moved here from Cincinnati a couple years back." I remember feeling a strange knot of emotions, happiness for him, because God knows the man deserved some joy after 4 years of quiet grief, and something else underneath it that I couldn't name at the time. Call it instinct. Call it the particular unease a daughter feels when a parent starts describing someone new in a voice she hasn't used in years. Vanessa was 51 when she met my father, 11 years younger than him, which wasn't in itself alarming, but combined with everything else, it became part of a pattern I'd only recognize in hindsight. She was polished in a way our family wasn't used to. Expensive highlights in her hair, manicured nails, the kind of effortless charm that made people want to lean in closer when she spoke. At the first dinner she attended with us, she complimented my mother's china, which she'd never met the woman who chose it, and asked thoughtful questions about each of us individually, the kind of questions that make you feel, in the moment, deeply seen. It took me years to understand that this wasn't warmth, it was reconnaissance. She learned that first dinner that Danny was recently divorced and touchy about money. She learned that Kimberly lived far away and would be, by simple geography, the easiest sibling to marginalize. She learned that I was the one who asked the most questions, noticed the most details, and would therefore need the most careful handling. I didn't understand any of this until much later, when I went back through years of memories with new eyes and saw the architecture underneath what had looked, at the time, like ordinary getting-to-know-you conversation. My father was smitten. And why wouldn't he be? He'd spent 4 years alone with his grief, and here was a vibrant, attentive woman who made him laugh again, who touched his arm when she spoke to him, who told him, I heard her say this once, at a barbecue, that he was the kind of man they don't make anymore. He believed her. I believe he needed to believe her. I want to be careful here, because I know how this sounds. I know it sounds like a bitter daughter who resented her father's happiness. That is not what this is. I was glad, genuinely glad, to see him laughing again. My objection, when it came, was never to the idea of him finding love. It was to a very specific pattern of behavior that started small and grew, over 3 years, into something that cost my father everything he'd built. They were married 14 months after that Rotary dinner, in a small ceremony at a vineyard 40 minutes outside town. I remember standing in the reception hall in a pale blue dress, watching my father dance with his new wife, and feeling a complicated grief I hadn't expected. Not grief for the marriage itself, but a strange, guilty mourning for the version of my father who'd belonged, in some private way, still to my mother. Danny walked him down. There's no aisle in a vineyard reception, but he escorted our father to the small arbor where the ceremony took place, since Dad had asked him to stand as his best man. Kimberly flew in with her family. I gave a toast at the reception, one I'd written and rewritten a dozen times, trying to find words that were honest without being unkind. I said that our father had taught us that love doesn't run out. It only grows to make room for more people. I meant it. I still mean it, actually, as an idea. I just didn't yet understand who I was toasting. Vanessa's family, What little of it showed up was thin and strange in a way I noticed, but didn't examine closely enough at the time. She had a grown son from a previous marriage, Tyler, who came alone, said almost nothing all evening, and left before the cake was cut. Her parents were both deceased, she said. No siblings, no lifelong friends in attendance, only a handful of women she introduced as my girls from the club, none of whom I ever saw again after that day. I know now that isolation is often a tool wielded by manipulative people, that they surround themselves with a thin, temporary circle of acquaintances because deep, long-standing relationships come with witnesses, with people who remember what you said 5 years ago and can call you on it. At the time, I just thought she'd had a hard life and didn't have much family. I felt sorry for her. That's the cruelest irony of the whole story. My sympathy was, for a long time, one of the very things that made me slow to see her clearly. The first year of their marriage was, from what I could observe, genuinely good for my father. He looked younger. He took up tennis again, something he hadn't done since before my mother got sick. He and Vanessa took a cruise to Alaska and came back with 400 photographs, all of which he insisted on showing me over the course of 2 separate dinners. I remember feeling, watching him laugh over those photos, that maybe I'd been wrong to feel uneasy. Maybe this really was just a second chance at happiness for a man who deserved one. I held on to that belief for almost 2 years, and then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, things began to change. The first thing I noticed was the Sunday dinners. For 30 years, minus the 4 he'd spent alone after my mother's death, my father had never missed a Sunday dinner without calling ahead. It was a small ritual, but a sacred one in our family. A standing appointment that had outlasted jobs, moves, divorces, and grief itself. About 18 months into the marriage, the cancellations started. First it was, Vanessa's got a work event, we'll do it next week. Then it was, we're just wiped out, can we do Tuesday instead? Then, eventually, it became easier for him to simply not come than to explain why, and the calls got shorter, more distracted, punctuated by Vanessa's voice in the background, always some reason he needed to go. I brought it up to Danny first, over coffee, trying to sound casual about it. Have you noticed Dad's been kind of hard to pin down lately? Danny, who by then had developed what I can only describe as a soft spot for Vanessa. She'd helped him through a rough patch after his divorce, sending him articles about co-parenting, checking in on him more than I had, if I'm honest, waved it off. He's just busy, Bex. He's newly married. Give the guy some space. I wanted to believe that. God, I wanted to believe that so badly, because the alternative, that something was actively, deliberately being done to slowly wall my father off from his own children, was too ugly and too frightening to sit with. So I let it go. I told myself I was being an overprotective daughter who couldn't stand to share her father's attention. But the pattern continued. Phone calls that used to happen weekly dwindled to once a month, then less. When I did get him on the phone, our conversations felt different. Shorter, guarded almost, as if he were checking a clock I couldn't see. Once, mid-sentence, I heard Vanessa's voice cut through, sharp in a way that didn't match the sweet, doting persona she performed for the rest of us. Walter, we need to leave in 10 minutes. He hung up abruptly after that, apologizing, promising to call back. He never did. Not that week. I started noticing other things too. My father, who had worn the same practical, unfussy style my entire life, flannel shirts, work boots, a wristwatch he'd owned since the Clinton administration, began showing up to family events in clothes that looked chosen by someone else. Slacks he clearly found uncomfortable. A haircut too young for his face. Small things, individually meaningless. Together, they painted a picture of a man being slowly, methodically remade by someone else's hands. There's a particular kind of denial that happens in families, I think, when the alternative to denial is confrontation with someone who has quietly become the gatekeeper to a parent you love. You start rationalizing. You start finding explanations that let you avoid the fight you're afraid you'll lose. The store was the next thing to change. Prescott Building Supply had been, for 40 years, entirely my father's domain. He still went in 3 days a week even after retiring, reviewing the books, chatting with longtime employees, making sure the business he'd built with his own hands was running the way he wanted. About 2 years into the marriage, Vanessa started attending these visits with him. At first it seemed sweet, a wife taking interest in her husband's life's work. But employees started mentioning things to me, carefully, the way people do when they're not sure it's their place to say anything. Our longtime store manager, a woman named Pat, who'd worked for my father for 26 years, pulled me aside at a company picnic. "Rebecca, honey, I don't want to cause trouble, but your dad's wife has been asking a lot of questions about the business finances. Asking to see statements. Your dad brushed it off as her being supportive, but it felt strange to me. I asked my father about it directly, the next time I saw him alone, which itself had become a rare occurrence. He waved it off, the same way Danny had waved off my concerns about him. She's just trying to understand my world, Becca. It's nice, actually, having someone take an interest." I let it go again. I want you to understand how insidious this process is. It doesn't happen in one dramatic confrontation you can point to and say, "There, that's when I should have acted." It happens in 100 small moments, each one deniable, each one explainable, until you look up one day and realize the ground has shifted completely beneath your feet. There was a moment, though, that I still think about more than any other. It was Thanksgiving, about 2.5 years into the marriage. My father had begun to seem, not unwell exactly, but diminished somehow, quieter, slower to find words sometimes, tired in a way that didn't match a man who still played tennis twice a week. I mentioned it to Vanessa in the kitchen, trying to be diplomatic. "Has Dad seen his doctor recently? He seems a little off lately." She smiled at me. I remember that smile so clearly, warm on the surface, something colder underneath it if you knew to look, and said, "Oh, I've got him all set up with a wonderful new physician, Dr. Reyes. Very thorough. We're handling it." Handling it. As if my father's health had become an item on her to-do list, rather than something his own children might want to know about, weigh in on, be present for. I asked for the doctor's information so I could follow up. She told me she'd send it over. She never did. I need to talk about Danny here, because his role in this story matters, and because I think a lot of families have a version of Danny, someone who, for reasons that make sense from the inside even when they're wrong, ends up on the other side of a fight that shouldn't have had sides at all. Danny's divorce had been brutal. His ex-wife had gotten primary custody of their 2 kids, and he'd spent almost 2 years in a fog of guilt and loneliness that none of us, myself included, had known quite how to reach. Vanessa had reached him, though, sent him a book about co-parenting after hearing about the custody arrangement at a family dinner, called him a few times just to check in, told him he was a good father even when the court paperwork implied otherwise. For a man who felt like he was drowning, that kind of attention was a life raft, and I do understand, why he grabbed onto it and didn't want to let go. So when I started raising concerns, gently at first and then less gently, Danny became Vanessa's most reliable defender within the family. "You've never liked her," he told me once, not unkindly, but firmly. "Ever since the wedding. I don't know if it's because you feel like she's replacing Mom or what, but you look for reasons to distrust her." That accusation stung because it had just enough truth in it to be disorienting. Had I disliked her from the start, because some part of me resented anyone replacing my mother? I turned that question over for a long time, genuinely trying to be fair, trying to separate legitimate concern from grief I hadn't fully processed. It's one of the most effective things about manipulators like Vanessa. They don't just deceive the person they're targeting, they deceive everyone around that person too, so that anyone who raises an alarm sounds, even to their own siblings, like the unreasonable one. Kimberly, from her distance in Arizona, occupied a middle position. She trusted my read on things more than Danny did, but she also wasn't in Ohio to see it firsthand, and long-distance concern has a way of feeling abstract, easy to set aside until the next phone call reminds you it's still there. "Keep me posted," she'd say. "Let me know if it gets worse." I did keep her posted. I didn't yet know how much worse was capable of getting. Looking back, I think Vanessa understood family dynamics with the precision of a chess player. She knew Danny's vulnerability made him easy to win over. She knew Kimberly's distance made her easy to keep in the dark. And she knew that I was the real threat. The daughter with a financial background, the one who asked pointed questions, the one who wouldn't simply take reassurance at face value. She couldn't win me over the way she'd won Danny over, so instead, over the following 2 years, she did something far more effective. She began, slowly and carefully, to cut me out. It was Kimberly's daughter's wedding, in the spring 3 years into my father's second marriage, that made the family finally, undeniably see what I'd been trying to describe for over a year. My father had always been a natural at weddings. He loved to dance, badly and enthusiastically, and he loved even more to corner young men at the bar and tell them, with a completely straight face, stories about how he'd once negotiated a lumber contract using nothing but a firm handshake and a look in his eye. He was, in short, the life of every family gathering for as long as I could remember. At Kimberly's daughter's wedding, he sat at the head table for most of the reception, quiet, occasionally confused about which course had just been served, twice asking Kimberly the same question about the flight schedule within 20 minutes. When my cousin Rachel came by to say hello, he looked at her for a long moment before saying her name, as if retrieving it from somewhere increasingly hard to reach. I watched Vanessa that night more carefully than I had in months. She hovered near him constantly, which on its surface looked like devotion, but I noticed the way she'd redirect conversations before he could answer, the way she'd finish his sentences before he could stumble through them himself, the way she positioned herself, physically, between him and anyone who might spend more than a few minutes talking to him one-on-one. Kimberly cornered me in the hotel hallway that night, her makeup smudged from crying earlier during her daughter's vows, her voice tight with something between fear and fury. "Becca, what is happening to Dad?" I didn't have an answer for her. Not a real one. Not yet. What I had was a gut feeling that had been building for 2 years, hardening from vague unease into something closer to certainty. "I don't know," I told her honestly, "but I think it's time we find out. Together. All 3 of us." That conversation, held in a hotel hallway at 11 p.m. while a wedding band played downstairs, was the beginning of what I now think of as the second half of this story. The part where I stopped simply worrying and started actually investigating. It took another 6 weeks, and considerable pressure from all 3 of us, before Vanessa finally allowed my father to see a neurologist we chose, rather than the mysterious Dr. Reyes she'd installed as his sole physician. The diagnosis, when it came, was early to moderate vascular dementia, likely compounded by a series of small, silent strokes that had gone entirely undetected because no one outside his household had been permitted close enough to notice the symptoms accumulating. I remember sitting in that sterile little consultation room, holding my father's hand while the doctor explained what the coming years might look like, and feeling a rage so total it frightened me. Not at the disease, which was cruel but blameless, but at the woman who had spent 2 years hiding this decline from the people who loved him most, who had kept him from proper medical care, who had, whether through negligence or design, allowed his condition to deteriorate in isolation rather than surrounded by family who might have caught it sooner. You would think a dementia diagnosis would be the moment a family comes together, closes ranks, pools resources and love and attention around the person who needs it most. In some families, I'm sure that's exactly what happens. In ours, it became the moment Vanessa began, in earnest, to build a wall. She framed it, always, in the language of care. "He gets so agitated when there's too much going on," she'd say, when I proposed visiting more often. "The doctor said routine and calm are essential right now," she'd explain, when Kimberly flew in and wanted to take him out for the afternoon. "He's napping," became the answer to nearly every unscheduled visit, delivered with such consistency that I began to suspect it was simply the default response, regardless of whether he was actually asleep. I started keeping a log. This is something I want to tell every person watching who suspects something similar might be happening in their own family. Write it down. Dates, times, what was said, who said it. I didn't know yet what I'd need it for. I only knew that my instincts, sharpened by 2 decades of forensic accounting work that had taught me to notice patterns other people missed, were screaming that something was deeply wrong, and that if I was ever going to prove it, I'd need more than a feeling. By the 4th month after the diagnosis, visits with my father had been reduced to a rigid schedule Vanessa controlled entirely. 1 supervised visit every 2 weeks, always in her presence, always cut short after 90 minutes with some variation of, "He's getting tired." Phone calls went through her first. She'd answer his cell phone, screen the call, and decide whether he was up for talking. Twice I was told he was unavailable, only to find out later, through Pat at the store, that he'd been out to lunch with Vanessa at the very moment I'd called. I remember the exact day I stopped extending Vanessa the benefit of the doubt. It was a Tuesday. I'd driven over unannounced, something I rarely did anymore, out of a strange, learned deference to her scheduling, and found my father sitting alone on the back porch, disheveled, wearing the same shirt I was fairly sure he'd had on 3 days earlier when I'd last video called. He lit up when he saw me, grabbed my hand with both of his, and said, with a clarity that startled me given how foggy he'd seemed on recent calls, "Becca, thank God. I've been trying to call you. She keeps taking my phone." I sat with him for 2 hours that afternoon before Vanessa came home from wherever she'd been and found us on the porch together. Her face, when she saw me, did something I will never forget. A flicker, quick and involuntary, of pure hostility before the warm mask slid back into place. "Rebecca, I didn't know you were coming by. You should have called." "I did call," I said. "Several times this week. I was told he was resting." "Well," she said, smiling, glancing at my father with an expression I can only describe as a warning. "He does tire easily these days." My father, still holding my hand, said nothing. But I felt his grip tighten, just slightly, and I understood, in that moment, that some part of him, some part not yet fully lost to the disease, was afraid. I want to tell you about one particular afternoon, because it's the memory I return to most often, the one I hold on to when the anger threatens to eclipse everything else. It was nearly a year after the diagnosis. My father's condition had worsened steadily. More confusion, more difficulty finding words, occasional flashes of frustration at his own mind's betrayal that broke my heart every time I witnessed them. But that particular Sunday, for reasons neither medicine nor luck can fully explain, he was almost entirely himself. Vanessa was out of town at what she described as a work conference, and for once, my father was left in the care of a home health aide named Marisol, a kind, patient woman who I'd later learn had been quietly documenting concerns of her own. I came by that afternoon, and my father greeted me by name, asked about Mark, asked about my job with an interest and coherence I hadn't heard from him in months. We sat in the backyard, near my mother's roses, which had somehow survived years of neglect, and Vanessa's evident disinterest in gardening. He talked about the store. He talked about my mother. A rare thing in those later years, since Vanessa's presence seemed to actively discourage any mention of her. He told me a story I'd never heard before, about the week he and my mother opened the second Prescott Building supply location, how they'd slept on cots in the back office for 3 nights straight because they couldn't afford to hire overnight security and didn't trust anyone else to watch the new inventory. Near the end of that visit, as the light went gold and long across the yard, he grew quiet, and then he said something that I've replayed in my mind more times than I can count. "Becca, I need you to promise me something. If anything happens to me, and I know things are getting harder for me to keep track of, I need you to make sure your brother and sister are taken care of. All of you. Equally. That's always been the plan. That's always been what your mother and I wanted." I told him I promised. I had no idea, sitting there in that golden afternoon light, how much that promise would come to cost me, or how directly it would collide with what Vanessa had already, by then, set into motion. Marisol, the home health aide, found me before I left that day and asked to speak privately. "Mrs. Hale," she said. She always used my married name, out of some old-fashioned formality I appreciated. "I don't know if this is my place, but I've seen some papers come through this house, documents your father signed. I don't think he understood what he was signing on some of those days. I've been keeping notes, just in case anyone ever needs them." I asked her to keep everything. I gave her my number and told her to call me, day or night, if she ever needed to. I didn't know yet how crucial those notes would become. I only knew, driving home that evening, that the sense of dread I'd been carrying for 2 years had just crystallized into something close to certainty. My father died on a Wednesday morning in March, 11 months after his diagnosis. The call came from Vanessa herself. Her voice, even in that moment, carefully modulated, grief-stricken but composed, the performance never quite dropping even in what should have been an unguarded moment. "Rebecca," she said, "I'm so sorry to tell you this over the phone. Your father passed away this morning, in his sleep. It was peaceful." I don't remember much of the rest of that call. I remember sitting down hard on my kitchen floor, my back against the cabinets, the phone slipping from my hand. I remember Mark coming in from the garage and finding me there, and somehow understanding immediately what had happened without a single word being said. I remember calling Danny and hearing him make a sound over the phone I'd never heard a grown man make before. I remember calling Kimberly and having to say it twice because she kept asking me to repeat myself, as if repetition might somehow change the words. My father was 70 years old. He had, by every account from the medical team who'd treated him, several more years ahead of him even with the dementia progressing. Vascular dementia is unpredictable, but it is rarely, on its own, fatal so quickly. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, which was plausible, which was even likely, given his age and his health history. I want to be clear about something here. I have never had proof, then or now, that my father's death was anything other than what it appeared to be. A heart simply giving out, as hearts sometimes do. I don't make accusations I can't support, and I won't start now, even in telling my own story. But I will tell you what I felt in the days that followed, which is that grief and suspicion arrived in my chest at the exact same moment and never fully separated again. I grieved my father with everything in me, and underneath that grief, I felt the first hard edge of the fight I didn't yet know was coming. The funeral was held 5 days later at the same church where my parents had married 43 years earlier. Vanessa planned every detail of it: the flowers, the music, the seating chart, the eulogies. She asked Danny to speak. She did not ask me or Kimberly. I want to tell you honestly that I didn't fight her on this. Grief has a way of making you choose your battles carefully, and I decided in that raw first week that I would rather grieve my father with dignity than turn his funeral into a battlefield. I sat in the second pew, beside my siblings, and I watched Vanessa receive condolences at the front of the church like a queen accepting tribute, dressed in a black dress that I happened to know, because I'd seen the receipt later, cost $1,100. The eulogy Danny gave was beautiful and heartfelt, and I was proud of him even through my own grief. Vanessa did not speak formally, but she gave what I can only describe as remarks disguised as spontaneous emotion. A carefully constructed few minutes about our whirlwind love story, and the 4 beautiful years we were blessed to share, delivered with tears that fell, I noticed even then, at conveniently theatrical intervals. At the reception afterward, held at the same vineyard where they'd married, I overheard 2 things that stopped me cold. The first was Vanessa's son Tyler, the one who'd barely spoken at the wedding, telling a stranger at the bar in a low voice he clearly didn't realize carried, "Man, she really pulled this one off." The second, worse, was Vanessa herself, speaking quietly with a woman I didn't recognize, saying, "It's done now. Everything's in order. I can finally breathe." I told myself in the moment that grief makes people say strange things, that I was reading too much into overheard fragments at the worst week of my life. I want you to know that I tried, genuinely tried, to give her the benefit of every doubt available to me. It would be another 11 days before I understood exactly what those 2 comments had meant. The will reading took place at the office of a lawyer none of us had ever heard of. Not Harold Bemis, the family attorney who had handled my parents' affairs for 30 years and who had, notably, not been contacted at all regarding the estate. Vanessa explained this by saying my father had updated his affairs with a new attorney, a man named Craig Delacroix, shortly after their marriage, for reasons of what she called efficiency. I sat in that conference room with Danny and Kimberly, my hands folded in my lap, trying to prepare myself for whatever came next. Nothing prepared me for what actually came. The will, dated just 8 months before my father's death, a full 7 months after his dementia diagnosis, left the entirety of his estate to Vanessa Colton Prescott. The house, the business, Prescott Building Supply, all 3 locations, appraised at just under $4 million, the investment accounts, everything, down to the last dollar, to a woman who had been married to him for less than 4 years. There was a single clause, almost an afterthought, that mentioned his 3 children, a token sum of $10,000 each, to be split, the document specified, in recognition of their relationship with their father, and with the hope that they will respect his final wishes. I remember the silence in that room. I remember Kimberly's hand shaking as she gripped the arm of her chair. I remember Danny, of all people, Danny, who had defended Vanessa for 3 years, going white as paper, staring at the document like it might rearrange itself into something less monstrous if he just looked hard enough. "This isn't right," Danny said finally, his voice cracking. "This isn't... Dad wouldn't..." Attorney Delacroix, a thin man with an expensive watch and a manner so smooth it felt rehearsed, folded his hands on the table. "I understand this is difficult," he said, in the tone of a man who had clearly delivered this exact line many times before. "But your father was of sound mind when he executed this document, and it was properly witnessed and notarized. I'd advise against pursuing a contest you're unlikely to win. Grief can make people want to fight ghosts." I looked at that man, and something in me went very still and very cold. I thought about the phone I'd been told. Over and over, My father was too tired to answer. I thought about Marisol's notes on documents he'd signed without understanding. I thought about, "It's done now. Everything's in order," spoken at my father's own funeral reception. And I thought, with a clarity that has guided every single thing I've done since. Sound mind. We'll see about that. The drive home from that lawyer's office is one I don't fully remember. Mark tells me I called him from the car, and that I was so calm, eerily calm in his words, that he almost worried more about that stillness than he would have about tears. Here is something I want every person watching this to understand about me, and maybe about themselves too, if you find yourself in a similar position. I am, by training and by temperament, a person who does not act on emotion alone. 22 years in forensic accounting teaches you that anger doesn't win cases. Evidence does. Patience does. The slow, methodical accumulation of facts that no lawyer, however smooth, can talk his way around. So in the days after that will reading, while Danny raged and Kimberly cried, and both of them, understandably, wanted to call every lawyer in Ohio immediately, I did something different. I went quiet. I went home. And I began, in the privacy of my own study, to build a case the way I'd built dozens of forensic investigations over the course of my career, starting not with accusations, but with documents. I called Marisol first. She still had the notes she'd promised to keep. Dates when Vanessa had brought papers for my father to sign, observations about his mental state on those days, even, remarkably, 2 instances where she'd taken photographs of documents on the kitchen table before Vanessa noticed and put them away. She agreed to meet me, off the books, at a coffee shop 40 minutes from her own house, out of what she described, with a kind of nervous, righteous determination, as owing it to a good man who was kind to me. Then I called Pat, the store manager, who told me something I hadn't known, that 18 months before my father's death, Vanessa had pushed hard for him to add her as a signatory on the business accounts, a request Pat had flagged to our father directly, and one he'd apparently agreed to, just to keep the peace. Then I sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad and began, in the careful, patient handwriting I use for every complicated case, to build a timeline. Dates of visits denied. Dates of the phone screenings. The date the dementia diagnosis was confirmed. The date, 8 months before his death, when the new will was supposedly signed. The date, several months after that, when the accounts were quietly restructured. By midnight, I had 4 pages of notes, a knot in my stomach, and a decision that would consume the next 14 months of my life. I was going to find out exactly what had been done to my father, and then I was going to make sure the woman who did it never got to enjoy a single dollar of it. 2 weeks after the will reading, I drove to my father's house, Vanessa's house now, in every legal sense that mattered, under the pretense of collecting a box of my mother's old photographs that I'd asked for during the funeral reception, back when Vanessa had still been performing the role of generous, grieving widow eager to share. She let me in with visible reluctance, hovering nearby as I sorted through a closet in what had once been my parents' shared study, now rearranged with Vanessa's decor, my father's old roll-top desk pushed into a corner like an afterthought. I moved slowly, deliberately, photographing everything I could with my phone under the guise of texting Kimberly updates about which boxes I'd found. What I actually found, tucked behind a stack of photo albums, was a battered accordion folder labeled, in my father's own unmistakable handwriting, Family Original Documents. Inside was a will, dated 6 years earlier, back when my mother was still healthy, and before Vanessa had ever entered our lives. That will split everything 3 ways between Danny, Kimberly, and me, with Vanessa's name appearing nowhere in it, for the simple reason that she hadn't existed in my father's life yet. I also found something more immediately useful, A folder of bank statements from an account I didn't recognize, a small business investment account my father had apparently opened 11 years earlier, separate from the main Prescott Building Supply accounts, seeded originally with proceeds from selling off a parcel of land he and my mother had owned. It had never been mentioned during the will reading. It didn't appear on any document Delacroix had shown us. Either it had been deliberately hidden, or it had simply been forgotten in the chaos and confusion of my father's final year, and given everything else I now suspected, I wasn't willing to assume the innocent explanation. I slipped my phone into my pocket after photographing every page I could manage, my heart hammering so hard I was sure Vanessa would hear it from across the room. When she asked, with poorly concealed suspicion, what exactly I was looking for, I told her, calmly, that I just wanted photos of my mother for a memory book I was putting together for my kids. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did, eventually, put together that memory book. It just wasn't the only thing I was building that afternoon. I drove straight from that house to a UPS store, printed hard copies of every photograph I'd taken, and locked them in a fireproof safe in my home office that Mark had bought me years earlier for tax documents. That safe would, over the following year, become the repository for what would eventually amount to hundreds of pages of evidence. I need to explain something about the work I do, because it matters for what comes next in this story. Forensic accounting isn't glamorous. It's not the dramatic courtroom stuff you see in movies. It's slow, patient pattern recognition, following money through accounts, noticing when a transaction doesn't match the story someone is telling about it, understanding that fraud almost never announces itself. It hides in the gaps between what people say and what the numbers actually show. I'd spent 22 years training myself to see those gaps. And once I allowed myself to actually look, really look, at what had happened to my father's estate, the gaps were everywhere. The first thing that struck me was the timeline of the new will itself. My father was diagnosed with vascular dementia in October. The new will, the one leaving everything to Vanessa, was dated the following June, 8 months later. Vascular dementia doesn't reverse. It doesn't have good weeks that undo months of documented cognitive decline in any legally meaningful sense, though it absolutely can have days, even hours, of relative clarity scattered among the fog, which is exactly the kind of window a patient predator would learn to watch for and exploit. I requested, through channels I won't detail here because some of them involved calling in favors from contacts I'd built over 2 decades in the field, copies of my father's medical records from that period. What I found was damning in its specificity. 3 weeks before the new will was signed, his primary care physician, not the mysterious Dr. Reyes, but a specialist we'd insisted he see for a second opinion, had documented, in his own clinical notes, patient exhibits significant short-term memory impairment. Recommends caution regarding any financial or legal decision-making without support of family or independent counsel. 3 weeks after that note was written, my father signed away a $4 million estate to a woman he'd been married to for under 4 years, using a lawyer none of his family had ever heard of, with no independent legal counsel present, and this detail took me another 2 months to uncover, with a notary public whose license, I would eventually learn, was under active investigation by the state for irregularities in at least 2 other estate matters. I started a spreadsheet that night. I still have it. It has grown, in the time since, to 11 tabs and hundreds of rows, but that first night it had exactly 1 entry, a single date, a single note, and the beginning of what would become the most important case I ever built, professional or otherwise. I knew, even with my professional background, that I couldn't do this alone. Forensic accounting could help me build the financial case, but I needed someone who understood elder law, undue influence litigation, and probate court procedure. Someone who could turn a folder of suspicions into an actual legal action with teeth. I found Elaine Cho through a colleague's recommendation, a probate litigator based in Columbus who had, as it turned out, handled 3 prior cases involving what she called late-life predatory marriages, a term I'd never heard before, but which described my father's situation with uncomfortable precision. Our first meeting lasted almost 3 hours. I brought everything: the photographed documents from the accordion folder, the medical records, Pat's account of the business accounts, Marisol's notes and photographs, my own spreadsheet timeline. Elaine listened without interrupting for the first 45 minutes, occasionally jotting notes, her expression giving away nothing. When I finally finished, she set down her pen and looked at me for a long moment. "Mrs. Hale, I want to be honest with you about 2 things. First, cases like this are winnable, but they're brutal. Financially, emotionally, and in terms of how long they take. We're likely looking at over a year, possibly 2, and there's no guarantee of the outcome even with strong evidence. Second, and I say this because you deserve to hear it plainly, what you've described to me isn't just suspicious. If even half of what you've found holds up, this is a textbook case of undue influence and possibly elder financial abuse, and I've seen enough of these to recognize the pattern in my sleep." She explained the legal framework to me carefully. Undue influence under Ohio law required demonstrating that the person who benefited from the will, Vanessa, had a confidential relationship with my father, that she had actively participated in procuring the will, and that the resulting document was unnatural or unjust in its terms given the family's history. Every single element, Elaine said, appeared to be present in what I'd already gathered. "There's something else," I told her, and I explained about the separate investment account I'd found, the one that appeared nowhere in the estate documents. Elaine's eyebrows lifted at that. If that account still exists and wasn't disclosed in probate, that's not just undue influence anymore. That could be concealment of assets, potentially even fraud. We need a forensic accountant to trace it. I told her, with the first real flicker of dark humor I'd felt in weeks, that I happened to know one. Elaine hired a private investigator, a former Ohio BCI agent named Robert Nash, to run a formal background investigation on Vanessa while I focused on the financial trail. Between the 2 of us, working in parallel for the better part of 4 months, the full picture began to emerge. And it was worse, far worse, than either of us had initially suspected. The hidden investment account I'd found in my father's old files still existed. It had been opened 11 years earlier with just under $200,000. By the time of my father's death, careful management, my father's own doing, based on the trading history, at least for the first 8 years, had grown it to just over $600,000. And 3 months before my father died, that account had been quietly liquidated and transferred to a joint account in the names of Walter Prescott and Vanessa Colton Prescott. An account that had been opened, I discovered through Nash's investigative work, using a durable power of attorney document my father had signed the same month as the new will. I want to sit with that for a moment, because it took me weeks to fully absorb what it meant. A durable power of attorney, once activated, can allow one person to manage another person's finances entirely, pay their bills, move their money, make decisions on their behalf. My father had signed one over to Vanessa 8 months before his death, during a period his own doctor had documented as compromised, giving her legal authority over every dollar he had, months before he even died. The new will hadn't been the only tool she'd used. It had been the second half of a 2-part strategy, the first half being financial control gained while he was still alive. Once Vanessa had power of attorney, the account movements accelerated. 6 figures transferred here, to an account solely in her name. A luxury vehicle purchased, titled only to her, 3 months before my father's death, using funds withdrawn from what had been, until that point, a joint checking account he'd shared with my mother and, after her death, no one else. A withdrawal of $85,000, 4 months before his death, that Nash traced to a real estate deposit on a condominium in Naples, Florida. Purchased in Vanessa's name alone, closing just 11 days after my father's funeral. 11 days. She had been closing on a Florida vacation property 11 days after burying my father. I remember calling Elaine the night I found that closing date, my hands shaking so badly I had to set the phone down on my kitchen counter and put her on speaker. She had this planned, I told her. This wasn't opportunism. This was a plan, and she was executing it before he was even in the ground. Elaine's voice, usually so measured, had an edge to it I hadn't heard before. Rebecca, I need you to send me everything you have on that transaction tonight. This changes the scope of what we're building here considerably. The next piece fell into place almost by accident, though Elaine would later tell me that in cases like this, accidents are usually just the natural result of pulling hard enough on any single thread. Marisol, the home health aide, remembered something during a follow-up conversation that she hadn't thought to mention before. A specific date, roughly 10 days before the new will was executed, when she'd witnessed my father struggling badly, unable to remember what year it was, growing agitated and tearful when Vanessa pressed him to just sign where I showed you, on what Marisol had assumed, at the time, was routine paperwork. That date meant something once I cross-referenced it against the medical records. It fell one day after an emergency room visit, one I hadn't known about until Nash's investigation surfaced the hospital billing record, where my father had been treated for what the intake notes described as acute confusion, possible transient ischemic attack. He'd been discharged the same day, without family notification, a decision Vanessa had made as his designated emergency contact and, by then, his power of attorney holder. The document Marisol remembered him signing that day wasn't the will itself. The will's official signing date was later. But it was, we eventually determined through Delacroix's own file production during discovery, an engagement letter formally retaining him as my father's attorney. In other words, on a day my father had been hospitalized for acute confusion the day before, he had engaged a new lawyer he'd supposedly selected himself, a lawyer none of his children had ever heard mentioned, to draft a will that would disinherit them. But it was the notary stamp on the final will that broke the case wide open. Elaine had flagged early on that the notary's license was under state investigation. What that investigation eventually revealed, through records Nash obtained via a public records request, was that the notary, a woman named Denise Farrow, who ran a small notary and shipping business out of a strip mall 15 minutes from Vanessa's house, had, in at least 4 other documented instances across 3 years, notarized signatures for elderly clients who were later proven, in separate legal proceedings, to have lacked capacity at the time of signing. In 2 of those cases, the notary's own logbook showed she had notarized the documents at locations other than her registered office, including, in one instance, a private home. A violation of Ohio notary law that alone was enough to suspend her license pending the outcome of the investigation. When Nash finally obtained a copy of Farrow's notary logbook for the date my father's will was executed, it listed the signing location as her office. But the medical records Nash had already obtained placed my father, that same afternoon, at a physical therapy appointment 40 minutes away, an appointment his own insurance billing records confirmed he'd attended, with a confirmed check-in and check-out time that made it a physical impossibility for him to have also been sitting in Farrow's office at the moment her log claimed. She lied about where it happened, I said to Elaine, staring at the 2 documents side by side on my kitchen table, feeling something between triumph and nausea. The notary lied, which means the will wasn't properly executed at all. While I worked the financial trail, Robert Nash had been quietly building a background profile on Vanessa herself, and what he found explained, with sickening clarity, exactly how well practiced this entire scheme actually was. Vanessa Colton, it turned out, was not, as she'd always claimed, a lifelong event planner recently relocated from Cincinnati. Her maiden name was Vanessa Kroll. She had been married twice before my father, the recently divorced cover story she'd given our family conveniently obscuring the fact that both of her previous marriages had ended not in ordinary divorce, but in the deaths of both husbands, each significantly older than her, each leaving substantial estates that had, in both cases, been contested by surviving children on grounds of undue influence. The first marriage, to a retired dentist in Michigan named Gerald Kroll, had ended with Gerald's death 9 years before he'd married Vanessa. 9 years after? Forgive me? 9 years after they married, his death coming from a fall down a flight of stairs that the police report, which Nash obtained, had classified as accidental. Though Gerald's adult daughter had, at the time, formally requested a more thorough investigation that was never pursued. Gerald's will, updated 14 months before his death, had left Vanessa the bulk of his estate, cutting his daughter out almost entirely. The daughter had contested it in probate court and lost, unable to prove undue influence with the evidence available to her at the time. Evidence that, Nash noted grimly, sounded remarkably similar to what we were now assembling against her a second time. The second marriage, to a widowed contractor in Cincinnati named Arthur Del Vecchio, had ended after just under 3 years when Arthur died of what his death certificate listed as complications from untreated diabetes. A condition, his son later alleged in a probate contest that also failed, that Vanessa had actively discouraged him from treating properly, delaying medical care and controlling his access to his own physicians in a pattern that, reading Nash's summary of the court filings, felt like reading a preview of exactly what had happened to my own father. I sat with that information for a long time before I could speak. "She's done this before," I finally said. "Twice before, and both times, the family's lost." "Both times," Elaine confirmed. "The families were fighting with less evidence than we have now, and without a forensic accountant in the family who knew exactly where to look. That's the difference here, Rebecca. That's the difference that's going to matter." I knew before we could file anything formally that I needed Danny fully on board, not just supportive from a distance, but actively engaged, because his testimony about the marriage's early years and his standing as the son Vanessa had specifically cultivated as an ally would matter enormously in court. I asked him to come over on a Sunday evening, told him only that I had important updates on the estate situation, and laid the entire case out on my dining room table, document by document, the way I would present findings to any client. I watched my brother's face move through disbelief, then denial, then a dawning horror that aged him 5 years in the span of 90 minutes. "The Florida condo," he said finally, staring at the closing documents. 11 days after the funeral. Becca, I sat next to her at the funeral. I held her hand during the eulogy. I told people she was one of the strongest women I'd ever met, how well she was holding up. His voice cracked. "I defended her to you. For 3 years, I defended her." "You didn't know," I told him, and I meant it. "She's done this twice before, Danny. She's good at this. She's had practice." What followed was one of the hardest conversations of my life, not because Danny didn't believe me, but because believing me meant confronting exactly how thoroughly he'd been used, and how much damage his defense of Vanessa had done. Not to me, particularly, since I'd never stopped investigating regardless of his skepticism, but to himself, to his own sense of judgment, to the guilt he'd now carry for having, in his words, handed her dad on a silver platter by making sure nobody questioned her. Kimberly's reaction, when I flew to see her in person the following week, rather than deliver this over the phone, was quieter, but no less devastating. She sat very still through my entire presentation, and when I finished, she said only, "I should have come home more. I should have seen this happening instead of just hearing about it secondhand." I told her what I'd eventually come to believe myself, after months of turning this over, that Vanessa had engineered the isolation specifically to exploit the geography and dynamics already present in our family, and that the blame belonged entirely to her, not to any of us who had simply trusted a father's judgment about his own second marriage, as any reasonable child would. By the end of that week, all three of us, Danny, Kimberly, and I, sat together on a conference call with Elaine Cho, united for the first time in over 3 years, and authorized her to file. Elaine filed the will contest and the accompanying petition alleging undue influence, lack of testamentary capacity, and fraudulent concealment of estate assets on a rainy Tuesday morning in October, almost exactly 1 year after my father's death. I remember standing in the courthouse lobby with Danny and Kimberly, watching Elaine hand the filing to the clerk, and feeling something shift inside me. Not relief. Not yet. But the particular steadiness that comes from finally, after so many months of quiet gathering, taking action in the open. The legal theory Elaine built rested on 3 interlocking pillars. First, lack of testamentary capacity. The argument that my father, given his documented cognitive decline at the time the new will was executed, lacked the legal capacity to understand the nature and extent of his estate, the natural objects of his affection, and the practical effect of the document he was signing. Second, undue influence. The argument that even if some baseline capacity existed, Vanessa had exploited a confidential, dependent relationship to substitute her own wishes for his, isolating him from independent counsel and family input at precisely the moments that mattered most. Third, and this was the piece that Elaine considered our strongest card, breach of fiduciary duty and fraudulent concealment tied to the power of attorney. The argument that Vanessa had used a legal instrument meant to protect my father's interests to instead systematically strip and hide assets, both before and immediately after his death, in a pattern that echoed, disturbingly, 2 prior marriages that had ended the same way. The petition named Vanessa Colton Prescott as respondent. It also named, as a co-respondent for the purposes of the fraudulent concealment claim, the estate's attorney, Craig Delacroix, and separately flagged the notary, Denise Farrow, whose conduct was referred, through a parallel filing Elaine helped us make, to the Ohio Secretary of State's Office for formal investigation into notary misconduct. Vanessa was served 2 days later at the house, my father's house. The house I'd grown up visiting for Sunday dinners for over a decade, now legally hers and, I would learn, already listed with a real estate agent for sale, the proceeds presumably destined to join the rest of what she'd extracted. Her response, when it came through her own newly retained litigation counsel, Delacroix, it turned out, handled estate planning but had quickly stepped back from active representation once litigation loomed, replaced by a sharp-elbowed defense attorney named Patricia Ostrander, who specialized, according to her firm's website, in protecting surviving spouses from opportunistic family disputes. Was an aggressive denial of every allegation, accompanied by a countersuit alleging that our petition constituted tortious interference and intentional infliction of emotional distress against a grieving widow. I remember reading that countersuit at my kitchen table, laughing out loud in a way that had no humor in it at all. "A grieving widow," I said to Mark, who was sitting across from me. "She closed on a Florida condo 11 days after burying him. That's her grief." The litigation that followed over the next several months was, exactly as Elaine had warned me at our first meeting, a grinding, exhausting process that tested every reserve of patience I had. There were discovery requests and counter requests, motions to compel production of the joint account records Vanessa's attorney tried repeatedly to withhold on privacy grounds, depositions scheduled and rescheduled, and an almost constant undercurrent of stress that seeped into every corner of my life, including, I'm sorry to say, my marriage, which strained under the weight of the hours I poured into this fight on top of my regular work. Mark never once complained about it, not really, though I know there were nights he went to bed alone because I was still at the kitchen table at midnight, cross-referencing bank statements. I want to say something here about the people who stand beside you during a fight like this, because their steadiness matters more than I think I fully appreciated in the moment. Mark handled our household, our kids' college logistics, our entire domestic life during those 14 months, without ever once suggesting I should let it go, should accept a settlement, should move on for the sake of my own peace. He understood, I think, that peace built on injustice wasn't the kind of peace I could actually live inside. Vanessa, through Ostrander, made her first settlement offer about 5 months into the litigation, once Discovery had begun producing documents that clearly worried her defense team, an offer to divide the estate roughly 60-40 in her favor, framed by Ostrander as a generous accommodation given the family's evident distress. Elaine relayed the offer to the three of us over a conference call, and I remember Danny's response most clearly. She's offering us 40% of what should have been entirely ours in the first place. That's not generous. That's an admission she knows she's losing. We rejected it unanimously. The second offer came 3 months later, after Nash's investigation into her prior 2 marriages had been formally disclosed in Discovery, and Ostrander had clearly begun to understand the scope of what we could present at trial. A 50-50 split still framed as generosity, still, in our unanimous assessment, an admission of guilt dressed up as compromise. I want to be honest about the temptation those offers presented. 14 months into a legal fight is exhausting in ways that are difficult to describe to anyone who hasn't lived through one. There were nights I lay awake calculating what 50% of a $4 million estate would mean for my family, weighing that guaranteed immediate resolution against the uncertain, expensive, emotionally brutal prospect of an actual trial. But every time I ran those numbers, I came back to the same place. This was never really about the money for me. It was about my father's actual wishes, the promise I'd made him on that golden afternoon in the backyard, that Danny and Kimberly and I would be taken care of equally, exactly as he and my mother had always intended. A settlement, however favorable the numbers, would let Vanessa keep something I wasn't willing to let her keep. The narrative that this had been a legitimate dispute between reasonable parties, rather than what it actually was. We rejected the second offer, too. Elaine, when we told her, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, the first I'd seen from her in months. "Good," she said, "because I think we're ready for trial, and I think we're going to win." If there was one single day during the entire 14-month process that I would point to as the turning point, the moment I felt for the first time that we weren't just fighting defensively but were actually winning, it was the day of Vanessa's deposition. Depositions, for those who haven't sat through one, are strange, formal affairs. A court reporter transcribes every word. Attorneys from both sides are present. The witness, in this case, Vanessa, sits across a conference room table, under oath, answering questions posed by opposing counsel, in this instance, Elaine. I was permitted to attend as a party to the litigation, and I sat beside Elaine, taking notes on a legal pad, watching Vanessa across that table for nearly 6 hours. She had dressed carefully for the occasion, understated, tasteful, a woman in mourning still, even 18 months after my father's death, still performing the role she'd perfected across 2 prior marriages. Elaine began gently, almost disarmingly so, walking Vanessa through the basic timeline of her relationship with my father, her prior marriages, her professional background. I watched Vanessa relax slightly as the questions seemed, on their surface, unthreatening. And then, with the precision of a surgeon, Elaine began to close in. Mrs. Prescott, can you describe the circumstances under which your husband first met with Attorney Delacroix? Walter found him through a referral, Vanessa said smoothly. A friend at the club, I believe. Which friend? A pause, barely perceptible. I don't recall exactly. It's been some time. Isn't it true? Elaine continued, her voice never rising, never sharpening, that you scheduled that first meeting with Attorney Delacroix yourself, using your own cell phone, on March 14th, approximately 5 months after your husband's dementia diagnosis? Elaine slid a phone record subpoena response across the table, records Vanessa's own carrier had produced in Discovery, showing the exact call, the exact duration, 6 minutes and 41 seconds, placed from Vanessa's number to Delacroix's office. Vanessa's composure held, barely, but I watched something flicker behind her eyes, the same flicker I'd seen once before, on my father's back porch, years earlier. I may have helped coordinate the appointment. Walter asked me to handle scheduling for him as his memory became more difficult. So you acknowledge his memory was, in your own words, before scheduling a meeting to draft a new will disinheriting them? The pause that followed lasted, according to the transcript I would read many times afterward, 11 seconds. In a deposition, 11 seconds is an eternity. No, Vanessa finally said. I didn't think it was necessary. I watched Elaine allow the smallest, most controlled pause of satisfaction before moving to her next line of questioning, and I understood, sitting there in that conference room, that we had just watched a woman's carefully constructed story begin, for the first time in 3 prior estates across 2 decades, to genuinely crack. The months following the deposition were consumed by pre-trial motion practice, a phase of litigation I hadn't fully appreciated the significance of until I lived through it. Ostrander, Vanessa's attorney, filed motion after motion attempting to exclude evidence, a motion to bar any mention of Vanessa's 2 prior marriages as unfairly prejudicial, a motion to suppress Marisol's notes and photographs as improperly obtained, a motion to challenge the qualifications of the geriatric psychiatrist Elaine had retained to provide expert testimony on my father's cognitive state at the time the will was executed. Each motion required response briefs, hearings, waiting periods for rulings that stretched the timeline further than any of us had anticipated. I remember sitting in the courthouse hallway during the hearing on the prior marriages motion, watching Elaine argue that the pattern evidence was not merely relevant, but essential. That a jury could not fairly assess whether Vanessa's conduct toward my father constituted a coordinated scheme without understanding that this exact scheme, documented in prior court filings from 2 other states, had played out twice before with 2 other vulnerable, aging men. The judge, a measured woman named Judge Alvarez who had clearly presided over her share of contentious estate disputes, ruled in our favor, though narrowly, allowing the prior marriages into evidence specifically for the purpose of establishing pattern and intent, while excluding certain details Ostrander had argued were too remote in time to be relevant. It was a partial victory, but Elaine assured me it was the victory that mattered most. Juries understand patterns, she told me afterward over coffee in the courthouse cafeteria. Once they see this isn't the first time, everything else falls into place in their minds. The motion to suppress Marisol's notes and photographs was more precarious. Ostrander argued that Marisol, as a paid household employee, had violated her duty of confidentiality and potentially trespassed on private information by documenting what she'd observed. Elaine countered that Marisol's observations, made during the ordinary course of her caregiving duties and voluntarily shared once she became aware of possible elder abuse, were both legally permissible and, frankly, exactly the kind of vigilance that mandatory reporter laws in Ohio were designed to encourage among caregivers who suspect financial exploitation of the elderly. Judge Alvarez agreed, allowing the evidence, though she cautioned both sides that she expected the actual trial to focus on documented facts rather than character attacks. By the time the last pre-trial motion was resolved, we were nearly 2 years removed from my father's death. I remember calling Kimberly that night, both of us a little stunned by how long this had all taken, how much of our lives had been reorganized around a fight neither of us had ever wanted to be in. "Do you ever wonder," she asked me, "what Dad would think, watching all this?" I'd thought about that question more times than I could count. "I think he'd be furious at what she did," I told her. "And I think he'd be proud that we didn't just let it happen." The trial began on a bright, cold morning in late January, in a courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Franklin County Courthouse, before a jury of 8, 6 women, 2 men, ranging in age from a woman in her 20s, working as a dental hygienist, to a retired postal worker in his late 60s who reminded me, in a way that made my chest tighten every time I glanced at him, of my father. Elaine's opening statement was measured, methodical, exactly the kind of presentation I'd have expected from a forensic-minded litigator. No dramatic flourishes, just a clear roadmap of what the evidence would show. "This case," she told the jury, "is not about whether Vanessa Prescott loved her husband. We may never know the full truth of her feelings, and frankly, it doesn't matter to the legal questions before you. This case is about what the documented facts show happened to a vulnerable man's estate in the final 18 months of his life, and whether the will and financial transfers you'll examine reflect his true wishes or someone else's." Ostrander's opening, by contrast, leaned hard into emotional appeal. A grieving widow, unfairly targeted by adult children who couldn't accept their father's right to remarry and redirect his own assets as he saw fit. Family members motivated by greed and resentment dressing up their disappointment as a legal grievance. I sat in the gallery, my hands clenched in my lap, and made myself breathe slowly through every word of it, reminding myself that this performance was exactly what Elaine had warned me to expect, and that our evidence, when it came, would speak louder than any opening statement. The first several days of testimony belonged largely to us. Pat testified about the pressure to add Vanessa to the business accounts. Marisol testified, her voice shaking but her account unwavering under Ostrander's aggressive cross-examination, about the day she'd witnessed my father struggling to sign documents he didn't seem to understand. The geriatric psychiatrist, Dr. Feldman, walked the jury through my father's medical records with a clarity that made the postal worker juror visibly wince at several points, explaining in plain, accessible language exactly what vascular dementia does to a person's capacity for complex financial decision-making, and why the timeline of the will's execution fell squarely within a period of documented significant impairment. Danny testified on the 4th day, and I watched my brother do something I will always be proud of. He stood in front of that jury and admitted, without flinching, that he had defended Vanessa for years, that he had dismissed my concerns, that he had, in his own words, made it easier for her to isolate my father because I wanted so badly to believe she was good for him. It was a hard thing to say in open court, and I know it cost him something to say it, but Elaine told me afterward that it was one of the most effective pieces of testimony in the entire trial, precisely because of its honesty. Juries trust people who admit their own mistakes. I testified on the 5th day. I'll tell you about that in detail because it was, in many ways, the moment I had been building toward for nearly 2 years. I had testified in courtrooms before, dozens of times, as an expert witness in other people's cases, walking juries through spreadsheets, explaining financial irregularities in language designed to be understood by people with no accounting background. I had never once, in 22 years, testified as anything other than a neutral, credentialed expert. Sitting in that witness chair on the 5th day of my own father's estate trial, I understood immediately how different it feels when the case is your own life. Elaine walked me through my background first, my career, my credentials, the fact that I approached my own father's estate not as a grieving daughter alone, but as a trained forensic accountant who recognized patterns most people would never notice. I think that framing mattered enormously to the jury. It gave them permission to trust not just my grief, which was real and which I did not try to hide, but my judgment, which had been sharpened by 2 decades of professional practice in exactly this kind of fraud detection. I walked the jury through the timeline I had built over those first difficult months, the diagnosis, the isolation, the phone screenings, the day I found my father alone and frightened on the back porch. I walked them through the discovery of the hidden investment account, the power of attorney signed during a documented period of impairment, the systematic liquidation and transfer of assets in the months before his death, the Florida condominium closing 11 days after his funeral. Ostrander's cross-examination was aggressive, exactly as Elaine had prepared me to expect. She pressed hard on the question of motive, suggesting repeatedly that my professional skepticism was really just a euphemism for resentment, that I had never accepted my father's remarriage, that I had gone looking for fraud because I wanted to find it, that a forensic accountant, given enough time, can make any set of transactions look suspicious if she's determined to. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Hale," Ostrander said, her voice sharp, "that you disliked Vanessa Prescott from the very beginning of her relationship with your father?" I had prepared for this question with Elaine for hours, and I answered it the way we'd practiced, because it was simply the truth. I was uneasy about the pace of things, and about some of her behavior early on, yes. But I want to be clear, I never once objected to my father finding love again. What I objected to, over 3 years, was watching him get cut off from his own children, watching his health decline in isolation instead of surrounded by family who could have caught it sooner, and eventually, watching a woman he trusted completely rewrite his final wishes while medical records show he was, in his own doctor's words, unable to safely make complex financial decisions. That's not resentment. That's what the evidence shows happened. Ostrander tried several more angles, suggesting my investigation was motivated by financial self-interest, suggesting I had coached Marisol and Pat in their testimony, suggesting that a $4 million estate was reason enough for any family to manufacture a case. Elaine had warned me this would happen, and I held my composure through all of it, answering each question directly, refusing to be baited into the kind of emotional outburst that would have undermined the careful, evidence-based case we had built over 2 years. It was near the end of my testimony that I said the thing I had been carrying inside me since that golden afternoon in my father's backyard, the promise I had made him. Elaine asked me, in her final round of questions, why this mattered so much to me. Why I had spent 2 years and a considerable portion of my own savings pursuing a case that could easily have been settled far earlier for a guaranteed, if reduced, sum. Because my father asked me for one thing before he died, I told the jury, and I felt my composure crack, finally, after 5 days of carefully held steadiness. He asked me to make sure my brother and sister were taken care of, equally, the way he and my mother had always planned. That wasn't a legal document. That was a promise, made to me directly, by a man who was still, in that moment, entirely himself. I am not here because of money. I am here because I promised my father I would make sure his real wishes were honored, and I intend to keep that promise, whatever it costs. I don't remember much of what happened in the courtroom immediately after that. I remember Danny, sitting in the gallery, wiping his eyes. I remember the postal worker juror looking at me with an expression I recognized, somehow, as belief. I remember Elaine, back at counsel table, allowing herself the smallest, most controlled nod. Vanessa took the stand on the 7th day of trial, and I want to tell you honestly that even after everything I now knew about her, watching her testify was, in its own way, a masterclass in performance. She wept at appropriate intervals. She described my father in terms so tender, so specific, that for a moment, even I found myself wondering whether some part of what she'd felt for him had been genuine, whether love and predation could somehow coexist in the same person. I've thought about that question a great deal in the years since, and I still don't have a clean answer for it. I don't think it matters, legally or otherwise. Whatever she felt, real or performed, it didn't stop her from doing what she did. Ostrander's direct examination painted a portrait of a devoted wife, managing an increasingly difficult caregiving situation with grace and sacrifice. A woman who had given up her own career, her own independence, to care for a declining husband, only to be rewarded with a lawsuit from stepchildren who resented her for being loved. Elaine's cross-examination, when it came, was the performance I will remember for the rest of my life. She began, deceptively gently, walking Vanessa back through the timeline of her 2 prior marriages, drawing out, piece by piece, the uncanny similarities, the significant age gaps, the relatively short marriages, the pattern of estate documents updated during periods of documented cognitive or health decline, the swift transfer of assets following each husband's death. Mrs. Prescott, isn't it true that your first husband, Gerald Kroll, updated his will 14 months before his death, naming you as primary beneficiary and substantially reducing his daughter's inheritance? I don't recall the exact timeline. Isn't it true that his daughter contested that will, alleging undue influence, in a case that was ultimately dismissed for insufficient evidence at the time? That case had no merit. The court agreed with me. The court found insufficient evidence to proceed, Mrs. Prescott. That's a different finding than the court agreeing your husband's daughter was wrong, isn't it? Ostrander objected, arguing the question called for a legal conclusion the witness wasn't qualified to make. Judge Alvarez sustained the objection, but the distinction had already landed with the jury, exactly as Elaine had intended. Elaine moved to the second marriage, walking through the same pattern with Arthur Delvecchio: the untreated diabetes, the restricted access to his own physicians, the estate transfer that followed his death, the son's failed contest. Then she turned to my father. Mrs. Prescott, you testified on direct examination that you scheduled Walter's initial meeting with Attorney Delacroix because your husband asked you to handle his scheduling as his memory became more difficult. Do you recall that testimony? Yes. And you're aware, are you not, that his primary care physician had documented, 3 weeks before that meeting was scheduled, that your husband exhibited significant short-term memory impairment and should not make complex financial or legal decisions without the support of family or independent counsel? I was aware he was having some memory difficulties, yes. Did you share that medical documentation with Attorney Delacroix before he drafted a new will disinheriting your husband's 3 children? A pause. I don't recall specifically discussing that note with him. Isn't it true, Mrs. Prescott, that you never informed Attorney Delacroix of that medical documentation at all, because doing so would have raised immediate questions about your husband's testamentary capacity? I don't recall the specifics of every conversation. Elaine let that answer sit in the silence of the courtroom for a long moment before moving to the financial evidence: the power of attorney, the account liquidations, the joint account transfers, and finally, the Florida condominium. Mrs. Prescott, Can you explain to the jury why you closed on a $410,000 condominium in Naples, Florida, using funds drawn from your husband's investment accounts, exactly 11 days after his funeral? For the first time in 7 days of trial, Vanessa's composure fully broke. Her voice, when she answered, had lost the practiced warmth it had carried through every previous minute of testimony. I was planning for my future. I had every right to plan for my future. 11 days after burying your husband of not quite 4 years, you were closing on a vacation property in Florida. I don't see what's wrong with that. Elaine paused, letting the jury sit with that answer. The answer, I would later think, that mattered more than any document, any timeline, any expert testimony. Because in that unguarded moment, stripped of the careful performance she'd maintained through every prior minute of that trial, Vanessa had told the jury, in her own words, exactly who she was. Closing arguments took place on the 9th day of trial, and I sat in the gallery between Danny and Kimberly, holding both of their hands, watching 2 years of my life distill down to a handful of final minutes on each side. Ostrander's closing was, as expected, an appeal to sympathy and to the principle of a person's right to control their own estate. She reminded the jury that people are legally entitled to leave their assets to whomever they choose, that grief and disappointment among adult children are not, by themselves, evidence of fraud, and that Vanessa Prescott had genuinely loved and cared for a declining husband in his final years, deserving compassion rather than accusation. Elaine's closing, when it came, was the culmination of everything she had built over 9 days of trial and, really, over 2 years of investigation and litigation. She walked the jury, one final time, through the evidence. Not with the dramatic flourish of a television courtroom, but with the patient, methodical precision of a woman who understood that facts, laid out clearly and in order, carry more weight than any amount of rhetoric. You've heard over these 9 days about a pattern, Elaine told the jury. Not a single suspicious transaction, not one ambiguous document. A pattern, repeated 3 times across 2 decades, with 3 different men, each older, each vulnerable, each isolated from family who might have protected them, each dead within a few years of marriage, each having signed away substantial estates during periods of documented cognitive or medical decline, each followed, within weeks, by significant asset transfers to the same woman. The defense will tell you that grief looks different for everyone, that love doesn't follow a predictable timeline, that closing on a vacation property 11 days after a funeral doesn't prove anything sinister. I would ask you to consider, instead, what Walter Prescott himself would tell you, if he could stand before you today. I would ask you to consider a man who built a business from nothing through decades of honest work, who raised 3 children who loved him enough to spend 2 years and everything they had fighting to honor his true wishes, who told his daughter, in one of his final moments of clarity, that his children should be taken care of equally, exactly as he and his late wife had always planned. The evidence in this case doesn't ask you to punish Vanessa Prescott for finding love or for caring for a declining husband. It asks you to recognize what the documents, the medical records, and her own testimony under oath have already shown you, that a pattern of predatory conduct, refined across 2 prior marriages, was carried out a 3rd time against a man who deserved better, and that his true final wishes, expressed clearly to his family before his capacity was compromised, deserved to be honored rather than erased. The jury retired to deliberate at 2:47 in the afternoon on the 9th day of trial. I remember every detail of the hours that followed with a clarity that still surprises me. The vending machine coffee Danny brought me that I never drank. The way Kimberly kept checking her phone even though there was nothing to check. The particular quality of afternoon light coming through the courthouse windows as it slowly faded toward evening. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and 20 minutes before returning a verdict just after 9 o'clock that evening, an unusually long day for the court to remain in session. But Judge Alvarez had agreed, given how close the jury seemed to a decision, to allow them to continue rather than sequester overnight and risk losing momentum. I have relived the moment the foreperson stood to read the verdict more times than I can count, and I still find it difficult to describe accurately because time seemed to both stretch and compress simultaneously. Every second impossibly long, and yet the whole thing over before I fully understood it was happening. On the question of testamentary capacity, the jury found that Walter Prescott lacked the capacity to execute a valid will on the date in question, given the documented severity of his cognitive impairment. On the question of undue influence, the jury found in our favor unanimously, concluding that Vanessa Prescott had exploited a confidential relationship to procure a will that did not reflect Walter Prescott's authentic wishes. On the question of fraudulent concealment of assets, the jury found in our favor as well, specifically citing the power of attorney abuse, the undisclosed investment account, and the pattern of asset transfers before and after death as clear evidence of a scheme to deprive the rightful heirs of estate assets. The new will was declared invalid. The earlier will, the one my father had executed 6 years before, splitting his estate equally between Danny, Kimberly, and me, was reinstated as his true and valid final testament. The power of attorney was retroactively voided for the period during which it had been used to transfer assets, and the court ordered a full accounting and disgorgement of every dollar Vanessa had moved during that period, including, specifically, the Florida condominium, which the court ordered sold, with proceeds returned to the estate. I don't remember standing up. Danny tells me I did immediately, before the judge had even finished reading the full verdict. I remember Kimberly's arms around me, both of us crying in a way that had nothing left of restraint in it. I remember looking across the courtroom at Vanessa, who sat perfectly still, her face for once entirely unguarded, showing something that looked, finally, like the real fear that should have been there from the very beginning of this entire scheme. Elaine turned to the three of us, and I will never forget what she said, quietly, just for us, before the courtroom's formal business concluded. Your father would be proud of you, all three of you. This is what justice looks like when a family refuses to give up. Outside the courthouse, in the cold January evening air, the three of us stood together for a long time without speaking, just holding each other, the weight of 2 years finally beginning to lift. I thought about my father's roses, somehow still alive in that backyard despite years of neglect. I thought about the promise I'd made him, kept now, finally, in the fullest sense the law could provide. And I thought, with a clarity that has stayed with me every day since, that some fights are worth every single sleepless night they cost you, because the alternative, silence, acceptance, letting the lie stand simply because fighting it is exhausting, is a cost far higher than anything I paid to win. Winning a verdict, I learned in the months that followed, is not the same thing as the fight actually being over. The court's ruling set in motion a long, complicated process of estate administration, inventorying assets, valuing the business, unwinding the fraudulent transfers, and eventually distributing everything according to the terms of my father's original, valid will. Ostrander filed an appeal on Vanessa's behalf almost immediately, which meant another 8 months of uncertainty before the appellate court, in a unanimous 3-judge opinion that Elaine described as about as clean an affirmance as you'll ever see, upheld the trial verdict in full, specifically praising the trial court's careful handling of the pattern evidence regarding Vanessa's prior marriages. Reading that appellate opinion, sitting alone in my study on a Sunday afternoon almost 3 years after my father's death, was one of the few moments during that entire ordeal when I allowed myself to cry from something other than grief or exhaustion. The Florida condominium sold for slightly more than its purchase price, given the market conditions at the time, and the proceeds were returned to the estate in full, along with the $600,000 from the hidden investment account and the various smaller transfers Nash had traced over the course of his investigation. The luxury vehicle was sold as well, its proceeds likewise returned. In total, the court-ordered accounting recovered just over $5 million for the estate. More than my father's original estimated value, once the growth of the various accounts and properties was factored in. Prescott Building Supply itself presented a more complicated question. None of the three of us had ever worked in the business day-to-day. Danny had a career in logistics management, Kimberly taught high school science in Arizona, and I had my own accounting practice. But all three of us felt strongly, once the estate was finally settled, that selling off my father's life's work to the highest bidder felt like its own kind of betrayal. We ultimately agreed to retain Pat, our father's longtime store manager, as general manager with an ownership stake, while the three of us maintained the business as a family investment, meeting quarterly to review its performance, a modest but meaningful way of keeping a piece of my father actively alive rather than reduced to a line item on a balance sheet. The equal division my father had always intended, the promise he'd made me on that porch, and the promise I'd made him back, was finally honored. Danny used his share to pay off the last of his divorce-related debts and put a substantial down payment on a house closer to his kids. Kimberly established a college fund for each of her 3 children and finally took the sabbatical from teaching she'd been dreaming about for years, spending 4 months traveling with her husband before returning to the classroom renewed. I want to tell you what I did with my share, but that story belongs in its own chapter, because it changed the entire second half of my professional life. The civil verdict, as significant as it was, turned out to be only the first domino in a chain of consequences that continued to unfold over the following 2 years. The notary, Denise Farrow, whose falsified logbook entry had helped crack the case wide open, lost her notary commission permanently following the state investigation, and the pattern of similar irregularities across her other filings ultimately led to a criminal referral for notary fraud, resulting in a plea agreement that included restitution to several affected families and a suspended sentence contingent on her cooperation in ongoing investigations. Cooperation that, as it turned out, implicated Vanessa far more directly than any of us had anticipated. Craig Delacroix, the attorney who had drafted the fraudulent will, faced a disciplinary complaint before the Ohio Supreme Court's Board of Professional Conduct. The investigation revealed that this was not, in fact, his first questionable estate matter. 2 other complaints, previously unresolved for lack of corroborating evidence, resurfaced once our case became public record. He ultimately surrendered his law license rather than face a full disciplinary hearing, ending a career that, according to a Columbus Dispatch article covering the fallout, had for years quietly specialized in exactly the kind of rushed, poorly documented estate planning that predatory spouses like Vanessa depend on. Perhaps most significantly, our case's publicity. Elaine's firm issued a press release following the appellate affirmance, and a local news station picked up the story under a headline about a daughter's 2-year fight against inheritance fraud, reached the adult children from both of Vanessa's prior marriages. Gerald Kroll's daughter, now in her 60s, contacted Elaine directly within a week of the story airing, and though the statute of limitations had long since closed on reopening her own father's estate, her account, combined with Arthur Del Vecchio's son's similar story, provided exactly the kind of corroborating pattern evidence that Ohio prosecutors needed to formally open a criminal investigation into Vanessa herself, not for my father's estate, where the civil verdict had already run its course, but for potential elder financial exploitation and fraud spanning all 3 marriages. I want to be careful here because the criminal case took years to resolve and remains, even now, a complicated chapter I don't fully understand the legal nuances of despite my professional background. Proving criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt is a different, much higher bar than the civil standard we'd already cleared. But 18 months after the civil verdict, Vanessa was indicted on charges related to elder financial exploitation, connected specifically to the power of attorney abuse in my father's case, the strongest and most recently documented of the three. She ultimately accepted a plea agreement rather than face trial a second time, this time with criminal stakes, receiving a sentence that included several years of probation, mandatory restitution beyond what the civil case had already recovered, and a permanent bar from serving as a power of attorney, trustee, or fiduciary for any Ohio resident going forward. I felt, when I heard the news of that plea agreement, a complicated mixture of things I hadn't fully expected. Satisfaction, certainly. A sense that the systems meant to protect vulnerable people had, eventually, however slowly, actually worked. But also a strange, lingering sadness, thinking about two other families, in two other states, who had fought this same fight years before us and lost, without the benefit of a forensic accountant in the family or the accumulated pattern evidence that had finally made our case undeniable. I think about Gerald Kroll's daughter often, and the years she spent knowing, in her gut, that something terrible had happened to her father, without ever having the resources or the corroboration to prove it. I think about how much luck, honestly, was involved in me having exactly the professional skills needed to catch what so many other families might have missed. Here is the part of this story I'm proudest to tell you, and the part that I hope, more than any other, might actually be useful to someone watching who's currently living through something similar. Somewhere around the 8-month mark of the litigation, long before we knew how the case would resolve, I started noticing something in my own professional life. Colleagues who'd heard fragments of what my family was going through began reaching out, not just with sympathy, but with questions. A woman I'd worked with years earlier on an unrelated audit called to ask if I could look at her aunt's finances, worried a new friend had gained unusual access to her accounts. A former client's daughter asked if I knew anyone who specialized in cases involving elderly parents and predatory new spouses. I realized, somewhere in the middle of building my own case, that I had accidentally become an expert in a very specific, very underserved area of forensic accounting. One that most traditional firms simply didn't have deep experience in, because most forensic accountants never have the specific, brutal motivation to learn it from the inside the way I had. About 4 months after the appellate court affirmed our verdict, I made the decision that would define the next chapter of my career. I used a portion of my inheritance, combined with savings Mark and I had built over 2 decades, to leave the mid-sized firm I'd worked at for 18 years and open my own practice, Hale Forensic Advisory, specializing specifically in elder financial exploitation cases, helping families identify, document, and pursue exactly the kind of fraud that had nearly cost my own family everything. I won't pretend the early months of building that practice were easy. Starting a business in your late 40s, after spending your entire career as an employee rather than an owner, comes with its own particular fears: the loss of a steady paycheck, the uncertainty of whether clients would actually come, the vulnerability of putting my name, quite literally, on the door of something that could fail. But I brought with me not just my professional credentials, but something I'd never had before starting this fight. A working template, refined through the hardest experience of my life, for exactly how these schemes operate, exactly what evidence matters, and exactly how to build a case that a jury, or a prosecutor, or a probate judge will actually believe. Within the first year, Hale Forensic Advisory had taken on 11 cases, Within 3 years, we'd grown to a team of 6, including Robert Nash himself, who left his freelance investigative work to join full-time once our caseload made that possible. We've since worked with families across 4 states, and while I can't share the specifics of ongoing or confidential matters, I can tell you that we have recovered, collectively, tens of millions of dollars for families who were told, in many cases by their own first attorneys, that their suspicions probably wouldn't hold up in court. I think about my father almost every single day I walk into that office. I think about the promise I made him, and how that promise, once kept, somehow expanded into something larger than I ever intended. Not just protecting my own family's inheritance, but building the exact kind of expertise and advocacy that might have saved Gerald Kroll's daughter years of unresolved grief, if it had existed when she needed it. There is a particular, quiet satisfaction in turning your worst experience into the exact tool that helps other people survive theirs. I don't think I fully understood in the darkest months of that litigation that this was where the fight was eventually leading me. I only knew at the time that I couldn't stop until my father's true wishes were honored. Everything since has felt like an unexpected, hard-won gift on top of that original promise finally kept. I want to spend some time talking about my relationship with Danny because I think it's one of the parts of this story that matters most, and one that doesn't get talked about enough in stories like this. The way betrayal from an outsider can fracture relationships between the people who were actually victimized alongside you. For those first 3 years, before the will reading, Danny and I had drifted into something close to estrangement over the question of Vanessa. Not a dramatic rupture, nothing either of us would have described at the time as a fight, but a steady erosion of trust and closeness that left us, by the time our father died, talking mostly in the polite, careful way siblings talk when there's an unresolved wound sitting between them that neither person wants to be the one to open. The litigation forced us back into daily contact, but forced proximity isn't the same as repaired trust, and I want to be honest that even after Danny came fully onto my side, even after he testified with such raw honesty about his own mistakes, there remained, for a long time, a residue of hurt on both sides that the legal victory alone didn't heal. I had spent 3 years feeling dismissed by my own brother, told, essentially, that my instincts about our father's safety weren't to be trusted. He had spent those same 3 years feeling, I eventually understood, a genuine and complicated affection for a woman who had specifically, deliberately cultivated his vulnerability after his divorce, and the shame of having been so thoroughly used sat heavily on him long after the trial concluded. It took real, deliberate work to rebuild what those 3 years had worn away. About 6 months after the verdict, Danny asked if we could start having a standing monthly dinner, just the two of us, no agenda beyond spending time together the way we used to before Vanessa entered our lives. I remember the first of those dinners being stilted, both of us circling around the elephant in the room until, somewhere around dessert, Danny finally said what I think we both needed. Said aloud, "I need you to know I believe you now, completely. And I need you to know how sorry I am that it took evidence in a courtroom to get me there, instead of just trusting my own sister." I told him what I'd come to believe, genuinely, over the course of that entire ordeal. That Vanessa hadn't just deceived him, she had specifically engineered his vulnerability into a tool, and that the blame for that manipulation belonged entirely to her, not to him. It took time for him to fully believe that himself, I think. But those monthly dinners, 3 years running now, have become one of the things I'm most grateful came out of the whole ordeal. A closeness with my brother that is, in some ways, deeper and more honest than what we had even before any of this started, because it survived being tested in the worst possible way. Kimberly and I never had the same rupture to repair, given her distance kept her somewhat outside the day-to-day dynamics Vanessa was managing, But the litigation brought the two of us closer in its own way, too. Long phone calls during the hardest stretches of discovery, her flying in for both the deposition and every day of trial she could manage around her teaching schedule, the particular bond that forms between people who've fought the same fight from different positions and come out the other side still standing together. There is a specific memory I want to share with you, because I think it captures something about how this entire ordeal ultimately resolved itself in my heart, beyond the legal victory and the financial recovery. About a year after the estate was fully settled, the three of us, Danny, Kimberly, and I, went together to visit our father's grave. Something we'd each done individually many times over the years, but had never, until that day, done together as adults, with the entire fight finally behind us. We brought flowers. We brought, at Kimberly's suggestion, a bottle of the cheap beer he'd always preferred over wine, which we poured, a little illegally I suppose, into the grass beside his headstone, the way we'd seen him do once at his own father's grave when we were kids. I told him, standing there, that we'd kept our promise. All three of us, together. I told him that Prescott Building Supply was still standing, still run with the same integrity he'd built it on, Pat now at the helm with an ownership stake he would have been genuinely thrilled about, since he'd always said Pat understood the business better than half the family ever would. I told him about my mother's roses, which I had, in fact, taken cuttings from before Vanessa's house was sold as part of the estate settlement, and which now grew, slowly but stubbornly, in my own backyard, tended with considerably more skill than either of my parents had ever managed. We established that same year a modest scholarship at the local community college in my father's name, funded jointly by all three of us, specifically for students pursuing trade certifications in construction and building management. The kind of practical, honest work my father had built his entire life around. Work he'd always said didn't get enough respect from a culture obsessed with four-year degrees. It felt, and still feels, like the truest way to honor who he actually was, beyond the legal battle, beyond the courtroom drama, beyond even the money that had been the ostensible subject of the entire fight. My father was a man who built things and helped people build their own lives, quietly, without ceremony, for 40 years. The scholarship, small as it is in the grand scheme of things, does exactly that, every single year. In his name. I think about him constantly, still in ways that have nothing to do with the litigation at all. His laugh, his terrible taste in ties, the specific way he used to hum while doing yard work, off-key and completely unself-conscious about it. The fight to recover his estate and honor his true wishes was, in the end, only ever a means to an end. And the end was never really about the money. It was about making sure the last chapter of his life and the legacy he left behind actually reflected who he was, a generous, honest man who loved his children equally and wanted, more than anything, to see them taken care of, rather than allowing that legacy to be quietly, permanently rewritten by someone who had never actually loved him at all, only what he could provide. I mentioned earlier that the litigation strained my marriage, and I want to come back to that, because I think it's an honest and important part of this story that I don't want to gloss over in favor of a tidier narrative. 14 months of active litigation, on top of the year of quiet investigation that preceded it, on top of running a full-time career, meant that Mark spent nearly 3 years married to a woman who was, for long stretches, distracted, exhausted, and emotionally consumed by a fight that had nothing directly to do with him. There were missed anniversaries, not forgotten exactly, but marked with less attention than they deserved. There were nights I fell asleep at my desk instead of in our bed. There was, at one particularly low point about a year into the process, a real conversation between the two of us about whether the toll this was taking on our marriage was sustainable. a conversation that scared me more than almost anything in the courtroom ever did. What kept us together, I think, was something Mark said to me during that difficult conversation, something I've held on to ever since. "I'm not asking you to stop fighting for your father," he told me. "I'm asking you to let me actually help carry this with you, instead of trying to carry all of it alone because you think that's what strength looks like." I had, if I'm honest, fallen into exactly that trap, treating my own resilience as something I needed to prove entirely by myself, as if accepting help somehow diminished the seriousness of the fight I was in. Learning to actually let Mark in, to tell him not just the facts of what was happening in the litigation, but the fear underneath it, the grief that never fully separated from the anger, the exhaustion I'd been trying to hide because I thought showing it would somehow weaken my resolve, turned out to be one of the most important shifts of the entire ordeal, and one that ultimately strengthened our marriage rather than breaking it. We celebrated our 25th anniversary about 8 months after the verdict, a trip to the coast of Maine that Mark had planned almost entirely himself, and I remember standing on a rocky beach with him, feeling, for the first time in nearly 3 years, something close to uncomplicated peace. He told me, that trip, that watching me fight for my father had been one of the things that made him fall in love with me all over again, not because he enjoyed watching me suffer through it, but because he'd gotten to see, up close, exactly what I was capable of when something mattered enough to me. I think about that often now, when I talk to other women going through their own versions of this fight. The people who truly love you don't need you to fight alone to prove your own strength. The strongest thing you can do sometimes is let someone else help carry the weight. If you've made it this far, I suspect some part of my story resonated with something in your own life. Maybe not the specific details, but the underlying shape of it. A parent whose judgment you trusted completely, suddenly making decisions that don't sound like them. A new person in the family who seems, in retrospect, to have arrived with a plan already in place. A slow, deniable isolation that made you doubt your own instincts long before you had any proof to point to. I want to tell you a few things I learned, the hard way, that I hope save you some of the pain I went through before I understood them. First, trust your instincts. Even when everyone around you tells you you're being paranoid, jealous, or unable to accept a parent's happiness. My instincts were right for 2 full years before I had a single piece of hard evidence to back them up. That gap between knowing and proving is agonizing, but it doesn't mean the knowing was wrong. It means the proving takes time, patience, and often professional help. Second, document everything, from the very first moment something feels off. Dates, conversations, small details that seem insignificant in isolation. I cannot overstate how much my early, informal habit of keeping notes, long before I understood I was building a legal case, mattered once the fight became formal. You do not need to know exactly what you're building toward to start building it. Third, financial control is very often the first and most important warning sign, arriving well before the more obvious forms of isolation or manipulation. If a new spouse, partner, or caregiver is pushing for access to accounts, power of attorney, or financial decision-making authority earlier than seems natural for the relationship, that is worth taking seriously, immediately, regardless of how reasonable the explanation sounds in the moment. Fourth, and this one took me the longest to accept, you cannot force other family members to see what you see on your timeline. Danny needed his own path to understanding what was happening, and pushing him harder, earlier, might well have entrenched him further rather than opening his eyes sooner. Sometimes the most useful thing you can do is keep building your own case quietly, so that when the people you love are finally ready to see the truth, the evidence is there, waiting for them. Fifth, professional help matters enormously, and it is not a failure to need it. I had a 22-year career's worth of forensic accounting training, and I still needed an elder law litigator, a private investigator, a geriatric psychiatrist, and a small army of experts to build a case strong enough to win. If you are facing something like this without my particular professional background, please understand that the right attorney, the right investigator, and the right expert witnesses exist specifically because this is genuinely difficult, specialized work that most people cannot and should not try to do entirely alone. And finally, the thing I most want you to hear. Whatever your own situation looks like right now, the smartest, most lasting form of justice is rarely loud. It rarely looks like the dramatic confrontation you might picture in your angriest moments. It looks like patience. It looks like documentation. It looks like refusing every settlement that asks you to accept less than the full truth, even when accepting it would be so much easier in the short term. It looks, in the end, like building something better and stronger out of the worst thing that ever happened to your family, and refusing to let the person who hurt you write the final chapter of your story. It's been almost 6 years now since my father died, and nearly 4 since the appellate court's final affirmance closed the legal chapter of this story for good. Hale Forensic Advisory has grown into something I'm deeply proud of, a practice that has helped dozens of families avoid exactly the kind of prolonged, uncertain fight my own family had to wage, because we know, now, precisely what to look for and precisely how to build a case quickly before assets disappear across state lines into vacation properties bought 11 days after a funeral. Danny remarried 2 years ago to a woman named Susan who Kimberly and I both adore, a kind, grounded elementary school teacher who reminds all 3 of us, in the best possible way, of the kind of steady warmth our mother used to bring into every room she entered. Kimberly's oldest daughter, the one whose wedding first made our family finally see what was happening to our father, just had her own first child this spring, a little girl they named Diane, after my mother, a choice that undid me completely the first time I heard it. Prescott Building Supply celebrated its 50th anniversary last year, still under Pat's steady management, still carrying my father's name over the door of all 3 locations, still, according to Pat, turning away no honest customer regardless of how small their order, exactly the way my father always insisted it should operate. I visit sometimes, just to walk the aisles, breathe in the smell of cut lumber that still, after all these years, brings him back to me more vividly than any photograph. My mother's roses, the ones I rescued from that backyard before it was sold, bloom every June in my own garden now, tended with far more care than either of my parents ever managed. A small, stubborn, living piece of both of them that survived everything that tried to erase it. I think, most days, about that promise my father asked of me on his back porch, in the golden light of what turned out to be one of his last truly clear afternoons. Make sure your brother and sister are taken care of. Equally. That's always been the plan. I kept that promise in the end, though it cost more than either of us could have imagined that day, and took a path neither of us would have chosen if we'd had any other choice. But I kept it. And in keeping it, I found something I never expected to find on the other side of so much grief and fighting. Not just justice for my father, but an entirely new purpose for the rest of my own life, built directly out of the worst thing that ever happened to my family. If you are in the middle of your own version of this fight right now, if you are the daughter, the wife, the sister, the stepdaughter, the mother who suspects something is deeply wrong and doesn't yet have the proof to say so out loud, I want you to know that your instincts deserve to be trusted, that patience and documentation are more powerful than anger, and that the truth, however long it takes to surface, is always worth the fight it costs to bring it into the light. My father taught me, across 70 years of an honest life and one devastating final chapter, that the truest measure of a person isn't what they say about themselves, but what the evidence of their actions ultimately shows. I believed that when I started this fight. I believe it even more now, on the other side of it. Thank you for listening to my story. I want to tell you about one of the first cases Hale Forensic Advisory took on, not because the details are unique. Sadly, they are not. And that's exactly the point. But because sitting across the table from that client felt, in a way I hadn't fully prepared myself for, like looking into a mirror pointed 2 years into my own past. Her name, and I've changed it here along with a few identifying details out of respect for her privacy, was Linda. She was 53, a pediatric nurse from a suburb outside Cleveland, and she came to my office 11 months after opening our doors, referred by an attorney who'd heard about our work through the same local news coverage that had, indirectly, cracked open Vanessa's older cases. Linda sat down across from me, opened a manila folder with hands that were visibly shaking, and said, almost apologetically, I don't even know if what I'm about to describe is actually a crime, or if I'm just a bitter daughter who can't accept her father's new wife. I recognized that sentence immediately, because I had said some version of it to myself, silently, hundreds of times during those first uncertain months of my own investigation. I told Linda what I wish someone had told me back then, that the fact she was asking the question at all, that she'd noticed a pattern specific enough to bring documentation to a stranger's office, meant her instincts almost certainly deserved to be taken seriously. Linda's situation had its own particular shape. Her father had married a woman 15 years his junior, following her mother's death from a stroke, and within 2 years, that woman had convinced him to take out a substantial reverse mortgage on the family home, ostensibly for home improvements, that Linda, visiting for a rare, unsupervised afternoon, could find no evidence had actually been performed. The funds, once we traced them through 6 weeks of forensic account work, had been transferred in a series of smaller amounts, each just under the threshold that would have triggered additional bank reporting requirements, into an account the new wife controlled independently. It took us 4 months, considerably faster than my own case had taken given the templates and institutional relationships we'd built by then, to assemble evidence sufficient for Linda's attorney to secure emergency guardianship proceedings, protecting her father's remaining assets and, crucially, ensuring he received proper medical evaluation for the cognitive decline that had made him vulnerable to the reverse mortgage scheme in the first place. Unlike my own father, Linda's father was still alive when the truth came to light, which meant her outcome, while still painful, included something mine never could. The chance for her father to understand, before it was too late, exactly what had been done to him, and to spend his remaining years back in the care and company of the daughter who had fought to protect him. Linda called me, about a year after her case resolved, just to update me on how her father was doing. Settled now in a well-run assisted living facility close to her own home, visiting her every single week, his finances protected by a guardianship that could no longer be manipulated by anyone claiming to act on his behalf. You gave me my father back, she told me, and I remember sitting in my office after that call, thinking about how strange and unexpected it was that the worst thing that ever happened to my own family had become, indirectly, the reason Linda got to keep hers. I've had a lot of time in the years since the trial to think about what actually motivated Vanessa, not to excuse what she did, but because understanding the psychology of people like her has become, professionally, part of the work I do every single day, and I think there's something worth sharing here about what separates predatory manipulation from the ordinary complications of blended families and late-life remarriage. What Vanessa never seemed to understand, across 3 marriages and however many decades of practicing this particular scheme, is that families like mine, messy, imperfect, sometimes slow to see danger, but ultimately bound by genuine love, are far more resilient than she gave us credit for. She built her entire strategy around the assumption that isolation would be permanent, that Danny's grief-driven attachment to her would never crack, that Kimberly's geographic distance would keep her forever on the periphery of any real resistance, that I would eventually exhaust myself against a wall of plausible deniability and simply give up, the way I suspect other families in other circumstances might have. She was wrong about all three of us, in the end, and I think that miscalculation says something important about the limits of manipulation as a long-term strategy. Manipulation depends on maintaining a performance indefinitely, on every family member staying exactly as fooled as they were on day one. But people change. Grief resolves into clarity. Distance closes when the stakes become undeniable. And professional skills, dormant in ordinary family life, activate with a vengeance when they're finally pointed at a threat worth using them against. I think, too, about the specific cruelty of targeting men like my father and Linda's father and Gerald Kroll and Arthur Del Vecchio, men who had spent their entire adult lives being providers, protectors, the steady center of their own families, reduced in their final years to victims who couldn't even recognize they needed protecting. There is something particularly ugly about exploiting exactly the trust and generosity that made someone a good father in the first place, using the very qualities that built a loving family as the vulnerability that eventually threatens to destroy it. But here's what I've come to believe most firmly, sitting across from clients like Linda, reviewing case files that echo my own story in ways both large and small. The people who do this, Vanessa included, ultimately underestimate the very families they're trying to dismantle. They see isolation as a permanent state rather than a temporary condition that can be reversed once the truth comes to light. They mistake a family's slowness to see danger for a family's incapacity to eventually fight back. Vanessa spent 2 decades refining a scheme that worked, imperfectly, twice before. She never anticipated that the third family she targeted would include a daughter with exactly the professional training needed to unravel everything she'd built, or that the very patience and persistence she counted on wearing down would instead become the tool that finally brought her entire pattern of exploitation into the light, protecting not just my father's legacy, but potentially every future victim she might otherwise have found. Since sharing pieces of this story over the past couple of years, I've received an enormous number of messages from women in situations that echo my own in one way or another, and I want to spend a little time here answering some of the questions that come up most often, because I suspect some of you watching are wondering the exact same things. The question I get most frequently is some version of, how do I raise concerns without sounding paranoid or resentful, especially to siblings who aren't seeing what I'm seeing? I wish I had a perfect answer for this, because it remains, honestly, one of the hardest parts of situations like mine. What I've learned, both from my own experience and from watching dozens of clients navigate the exact same dynamic, is that leading with specific, factual observations tends to land better than leading with feelings, even when the feelings are entirely justified. I've noticed Dad has missed 6 Sunday dinners in a row, and every time I call, I'm told he's resting. Opens a conversation more effectively than, "I don't trust her," even though both statements might be pointing at the exact same underlying truth. Facts are harder to dismiss as jealousy or grief. Feelings, unfortunately, are easy for a skeptical sibling to wave away, especially if a manipulator has already worked to plant the idea that your concerns come from resentment rather than genuine worry. The second most common question is about timing. How long is too long to wait before taking formal action? And how do you know when quiet documentation needs to become an active investigation? My honest answer is that there's no universal timeline, but there are trigger points worth watching for closely. Any request for power of attorney or account access earlier than seems natural in the relationship, any sudden change in estate planning documents, any pattern of medical care being restricted or hidden from the rest of the family, and any escalating isolation that prevents you from having private, unsupervised time with the person you're worried about. If you notice more than one of these simultaneously, that combination, in my professional experience, is worth acting on immediately rather than continuing to simply observe and document. The third question, and maybe the one that breaks my heart most to answer honestly, is whether it's possible to protect a parent from this kind of manipulation while they're still alive and it's still happening, rather than only being able to seek justice afterward, the way my own family ultimately had to. The honest answer is yes, but it requires acting earlier and more assertively than most of us are naturally inclined to, especially when the person doing the damage is presenting to the outside world as a loving and devoted spouse. Guardianship proceedings, adult protective services reports, and formal capacity evaluations exist precisely for situations like this, and I would rather see 100 families pursue those options too early and find their concerns unfounded than see even one more family go through what mine did, discovering the full truth only after it's too late to actually protect the parent at the center of it. I want to end this part of the story by talking honestly about something that took me a long time to fully accept, which is the particular kind of guilt that lingers even after a fight like this is won. For a long time after the verdict, even after the appellate affirmance, even after the estate was fully settled and distributed according to my father's true wishes, I carried a quiet, persistent guilt about the 2 years I hadn't spent simply grieving my father the way I might have if none of this had happened. Instead of allowing myself the uncomplicated sadness of losing a parent, I had spent that time building spreadsheets, sitting through depositions, preparing for cross-examination, channeling grief into something that looked, from the outside, more like determination than sorrow. It took real conversations with a therapist I eventually started seeing, about a year after the trial concluded, to understand that this wasn't actually a failure to grieve properly. It was simply a different shape of grief, one that channeled itself into action, because action was, for me, the only available response to a betrayal this specific and this total. I've since come to believe that there's no single correct way to mourn someone, and that fighting for the truth about how they were treated in their final years is, for some of us, exactly as legitimate a form of love and grief as sitting quietly with photographs and memories. I still grieve my father 6 years later in the ordinary ways, missing his voice on the phone, wishing he could have met his newest great-granddaughter, wishing I could ask him 1,000 small questions about the business, about my mother, about his own childhood that I never thought to ask while he was alive and available to answer them. But I no longer carry guilt about the specific shape my grief took in those first 2 years. I fought for him because I loved him, and I believe, with everything in me, that he would understand exactly why I chose that particular way of honoring him, even if it meant 2 years I could never get back, filled with courtrooms and depositions instead of simple, uncomplicated mourning. If you are in the middle of a fight like mine right now, and you find yourself wondering whether you're grieving correctly, whether channeling your loss into investigation and legal action instead of quiet sadness means something is wrong with you, I want you to hear this clearly. It doesn't. Love takes whatever shape the circumstances demand of it. Sometimes that shape is soft and quiet. Sometimes it's a spreadsheet with 11 tabs, a fireproof safe full of documents, and a promise kept 2 years later than you ever wanted it to take. 6 years ago, I sat in a lawyer's office and heard that my father, a man who had loved his children equally and completely for his entire life, had apparently signed away everything to a woman he'd known for less than 5 years, cutting out the 3 people he'd raised, provided for, and promised, explicitly, would be taken care of. In that moment, I felt something break inside me that I genuinely wasn't sure could ever be repaired. I want you to know that it was repaired eventually, though not in the way I expected and not on any timeline I would have chosen. It was repaired through patience I didn't know I had, through professional skills I'd spent decades building without ever imagining I'd need them for my own family, through a brother and sister who eventually stood beside me with everything they had, and through a husband who learned, alongside me, that love sometimes means simply helping someone carry a weight too heavy to carry alone. If there is one thing I hope you take from this story, whatever your own circumstances look like right now, it's this. The truth has a way of surfacing, eventually, if you refuse to stop looking for it. It rarely surfaces quickly. It almost never surfaces without cost. But it surfaces. And on the other side of that surfacing, whatever form your own fight takes, there is the particular, hard-won piece of knowing you didn't let a lie stand simply because the truth was difficult to prove. My father built a business out of nothing, using nothing but honest work and his own two hands. He taught me, without ever quite saying it in these words, that the things worth having are almost always the things worth fighting for. I carried that lesson through 2 years of a fight I never wanted, and I carry it still, every day, in the work I do now for families living through their own versions of what mine survived. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. If any part of it resonated with something happening in your own life, I hope it gave you, at minimum, the sense that your instincts are worth trusting, and that whatever fight you're facing, you don't have to face it without believing, all the way through, that the truth is worth every single thing it costs to find. I haven't told this part of the story yet, and I think it belongs here, because I don't want anyone watching this to think my resolve during those 2 years was constant, unwavering, some kind of superhuman steadiness I simply willed into existence. It wasn't. There was one specific night, about 10 months into the litigation, when I came closer to walking away than at any other point in the entire fight, and I think that night matters as much as the verdict itself. It was a Thursday in late autumn, about a week after Ostrander's second settlement offer, the 50-50 split we'd ultimately rejected. I remember sitting at my kitchen table well past midnight, staring at a spreadsheet I'd looked at so many times the numbers had stopped meaning anything, and feeling a wave of exhaustion so total it felt almost physical, like something pressing down on my chest. Legal fees, even with Elaine working at a reduced rate out of what I eventually understood was her own genuine investment in the case, had eaten through a significant portion of our savings. My accounting practice, which I was still working full-time throughout the litigation, had suffered from my divided attention in ways that were starting to show up in missed deadlines and a client or two who'd quietly taken their business elsewhere. Mark and I had had that difficult conversation about the toll this was taking on our marriage just 2 weeks earlier, and the fear from that conversation was still sitting heavy in my chest. I remember thinking, with a clarity that frightened me, that 50% of $4 million was still an enormous amount of money, more than enough to secure my own family's future many times over, and that maybe, just maybe, continuing to fight for the full, true value of my father's actual wishes wasn't worth what it was costing everyone I loved. I sat with that thought for a long time that night, turning it over, testing its weight, wondering if accepting it made me pragmatic, or if it made me exactly the kind of person who lets injustice stand, because fighting it is simply too exhausting. I called Kimberly, unable to sleep, needing to say the thought out loud to someone before I let it settle into a decision. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before she said something I've never forgotten. "Becca, I trust whatever you decide, because you've carried more of this than either Danny or I have, and you have every right to be exhausted. But I need you to ask yourself one question before you decide anything. If you take the settlement, Will you actually be able to live with knowing she keeps the story she's telling about herself? Not just the money, the story. That this was a real love, tragically misunderstood by a bitter family. Can you live with that story being the official record? I sat with that question long after we hung up, and I realized, somewhere around 2 in the morning, staring at my mother's photograph on the kitchen wall, that I couldn't. It wasn't really about the money, and it had never really been about the money. Not fully. It was about refusing to let a woman who had done this twice before, and who was clearly prepared to do it again to someone else's father if we let her walk away with a quiet financial settlement and her reputation intact, simply continue on with her life as though nothing had happened. Settling wasn't just accepting less money, it was accepting her narrative. And I found, in that exhausted, unbearably honest hour of the night, that I would rather lose everything fighting for the truth than win a comfortable settlement built on a lie. I called Elaine the next morning and told her we were rejecting the offer, and that we were prepared to go all the way to trial no matter how long it took. I don't regret that decision for a single moment, even knowing now everything it cost to see it through. But I want you to know that the decision wasn't easy, and it wasn't made from a place of unwavering strength. It was made at 2 in the morning, exhausted and afraid, by a woman who simply couldn't accept a lie standing in place of the truth, even when the lie came with a very large check attached to it. I've thought, many times over the years since this all resolved, about what I would tell the version of myself who sat at that Rotary dinner story my father told, all those years ago, not yet understanding what was coming. I've come close to writing it down as an actual letter more than once, and I think, finally, I want to share some version of it here, because I suspect there's a woman watching this right now who is exactly where I was back then, sensing something is wrong, without yet having any way to prove it, wondering if she's simply an ungenerous daughter unable to share her father's happiness. Dear Rebecca, 5 years before any of this started, your instincts about the pace of things, about the small inconsistencies in her stories, about the particular way she seems to already know exactly what each of you needs to hear. Those instincts are not jealousy. They are not an inability to accept your father's second chance at love. They are the accumulated pattern recognition of a woman who has spent her entire career learning to notice when a story doesn't add up, and you should trust them far sooner and far more completely than you're about to. You are going to spend nearly 3 years second-guessing yourself, letting your brother's skepticism and your own desire to be fair make you slower to act than you should have been. I understand why. Confronting the possibility that someone your father loves, someone he chose, might be actively harming him is one of the hardest things a daughter can be asked to consider. And every instinct you have will push you toward finding the more comfortable explanation instead. I want you to know that it's all right, that it took you as long as it did to act. Grief, love, and the desire to give people the benefit of the doubt are not character flaws, even when they slow you down in situations exactly like this one. But I also want you to know that when you finally do act, when you finally allow yourself to trust what you've been seeing all along, you are going to discover that you have exactly the skills you need, sharpened over 2 decades of a career you built for entirely different reasons, to fight this and win. You will find a lawyer who believes you before the full evidence is even assembled. You will find a home health aide whose quiet vigilance becomes crucial to the entire case. You will find, eventually, a brother who comes fully back to your side, and a marriage strong enough to survive years of divided attention. You will find, at the absolute end of the hardest 2 years of your life, not just justice for your father, but an entirely new purpose that will define the rest of your career. None of this makes the fight easier while you're actually living through it. But I want younger me, And every woman watching this who recognizes even a piece of her own situation in mine, to know the version of you on the other side of this fight is stronger than you can currently imagine, and the promise you're afraid you won't be able to keep is one you absolutely will keep, however long and however much it costs to get there. I want to close with a simple update on where everyone in this story stands today, because I think there's something valuable in seeing not just how the fight ended, but how ordinary and settled life eventually becomes again, even after something this consuming. Danny and Susan celebrated their first wedding anniversary this past spring, a small backyard ceremony that felt, in every way, like the antithesis of the elaborate vineyard wedding that started this entire chapter of our family's life. Simple, warm, entirely without pretense, exactly the kind of celebration our father would have loved best. He still runs his logistics career, still coaches his younger son's baseball team on weekends, still calls me every single Sunday now, a ritual neither of us ever wants to let lapse again, the way it once did. Kimberly finished her sabbatical and returned to teaching high school science with, by her own account, a renewed sense of purpose she hadn't expected. Her daughter and new granddaughter, baby Diane, visit often enough that Kimberly has started, half-jokingly, threatening to finally move back to Ohio to be closer to all of us. I hope she does. I think all three of us have come to understand, in a way we perhaps took for granted before any of this happened, exactly how much proximity and presence matter in a family, and exactly how much damage can be done when distance and isolation are allowed to take root, unchallenged. Pat retired from day-to-day management of Prescott Building Supply just last year, handing the reins to a longtime assistant manager she'd trained personally, though she remains, at our insistence, on the board as an advisor, unwilling and, honestly, unable to fully let go of a business she'd helped my father build for over 4 decades. The 3 locations remain exactly where they've always been, still carrying my father's name, still, according to every customer I've ever spoken with, exactly as honest and community-focused as he always insisted they be. Hale Forensic Advisory now employs 9 people across 2 office locations, and we've expanded our work beyond individual family cases to include training seminars for financial advisors and elder law attorneys on recognizing the early warning signs of exactly the kind of exploitation my own family lived through. I never imagined, sitting in that lawyer's office 6 years ago hearing the terms of a fraudulent will for the first time, that the worst day of my professional and personal life would eventually lead me here. Mark and I are, if anything, closer now than we were before any of this started, having learned, the hard way, exactly what our marriage could withstand, and exactly how much stronger we became by learning to carry hard things together rather than separately. We've started planning, tentatively, for the kind of long, unhurried retirement travel my father never quite got the chance to enjoy himself, and every time we discuss it, I feel a quiet gratitude that I get to imagine that future at all, rather than spending it, as I once feared I might, still fighting in courtrooms for a truth that never came to light. My father's roses bloomed again this June, right on schedule. The same stubborn, unglamorous flowers that outlasted 4 years of grief-stricken neglect, 3 years of a marriage that tried to erase everything he'd built, and 6 years since his death, still coming back every single spring in my own backyard, exactly the way he always insisted they would, no matter how badly anyone tried to kill them. I think there's something in that persistence that captures everything I've tried to tell you in this story, better than any single sentence I could write. Some things simply refuse to die, no matter how hard someone tries to bury them. The truth is one of those things. So, it turns out, is love, properly fought for. And so, in the end, was my father's actual legacy. Battered, buried for a while under someone else's greed, but ultimately, patiently, completely restored. There's a small detail I've held back until now, mostly because it felt too private to share until I understood what it actually meant to me. And I want to end with it, because I think it captures the entire arc of this story better than any conclusion I could construct on purpose. A few months after the estate was finally settled, I was going through one of the last boxes from my father's old roll-top desk, the one Marisol had helped me identify years earlier, now finally in my own home after the long process of estate distribution. Tucked into a drawer I hadn't fully searched, beneath a stack of old receipts and business cards, I found a small spiral notebook, its cover worn soft with age, filled with my father's handwriting in blue ballpoint pen. It wasn't a diary, not exactly. It was closer to a ledger of small things: birthdays, anniversaries, notes to himself about gift ideas for each of us, a running list of little moments he apparently hadn't wanted to forget. There was an entry, dated almost a year before he met Vanessa, that simply read, "Becca called just to talk today. Good kid. Her mother would be proud of how she turned out." There was another, later, dated only a few months before the dementia diagnosis. Harder to read. The handwriting noticeably less steady than the earlier entries. "Feeling foggy again today. Don't like it. Need to talk to the kids about the important things while I still can." I sat on my office floor for a long time with that notebook, understanding, finally, with a clarity that no legal document had ever quite given me, that some part of my father had known, even in the fog of his declining health, exactly what mattered most and exactly who he wanted protected. He hadn't been able to stop what was happening to him, but he'd tried, in whatever small ways his failing mind still allowed, to hold on to the truth of who he was and what he wanted, right up until the disease and the woman who exploited it finally took even that from him. That notebook sits on my desk now, in the office where I run Hale Forensic Advisory, where I spend my days helping other families find exactly the kind of truth my father tried, in his own quiet way, to leave behind for us. I look at it sometimes, on the hardest days of a difficult case, and I remember that this entire fight was never really about proving a lawyer wrong, or besting an opposing counsel, or even recovering a specific dollar amount. It was about honoring a man who spent his whole life trying to do right by the people he loved, right up until the very end, even when his own mind was working against him. I think that's the truest thing I can tell you about justice in the end. It isn't really about punishment, though accountability matters enormously. It isn't really about money, though the money mattered too, in practical and necessary ways. It's about making sure the truth of a person's life and love survives them, intact, regardless of who tries to rewrite it once they're no longer able to speak for themselves. My father couldn't finish that fight himself. But he left just enough behind: a promise on a back porch, a notebook in a desk drawer, 3 children who loved him enough to notice when something was wrong, for the rest of us to finish it for him. That, I've come to believe, is the only kind of legacy that actually matters in the end. Not what you leave behind in a will, but what you leave behind in the people who loved you, and in their willingness to fight for the truth of who you really were, long after you're no longer here to tell it yourself. People ask me, more often than almost anything else, whether I've forgiven Vanessa. It's a fair question, and I understand why it comes up so frequently. There's a cultural expectation, particularly strong for women, that a story like mine is supposed to end with some kind of graceful absolution, a moment where I find peace by releasing my anger toward the person who caused so much harm. I want to answer that question honestly, because I think the honest answer matters more than the comfortable one. I have not forgiven Vanessa, not in the sense most people mean when they use that word. I don't carry active rage toward her anymore. That particular fire burned itself out somewhere during the years of litigation, replaced by something closer to clear-eyed understanding of exactly what she is and exactly what she did. But I don't believe forgiveness, in the sense of absolution or reconciliation, is owed to someone who has shown, across 3 marriages and 2 decades, no genuine remorse, only calculated adjustment when caught. I've come to believe that forgiveness extended to someone who hasn't earned it, who would, given the chance, likely do the exact same thing to another vulnerable person, isn't actually a virtue. It's simply a failure to hold someone accountable, dressed up in more palatable language. What I have found instead, and what I think matters far more than forgiveness in the traditional sense, is release from the need to think about her at all. For a long time, in the years right after the verdict, I found myself still turning her over in my mind, replaying moments, searching for signs I should have caught earlier, carrying a kind of low-grade resentment that colored even good days. That has faded now, not because I've forgiven her, but because my life has grown so much larger and fuller than the space she once occupied in it. My father's memory, my relationships with Danny and Kimberly, the work I do now helping other families, none of that requires forgiving Vanessa to exist and to matter. It exists entirely independent of her, which I think, in the end, is a more meaningful kind of freedom than forgiveness would have given me anyway. I don't know what happened to her after her probation ended. I made a deliberate choice, at some point in the years following the verdict, to stop tracking her movements, stop wondering whether she'd found a fourth vulnerable man to target, stop letting her occupy any further space in my thoughts than was strictly necessary. That choice, more than any formal act of forgiveness, is what actually let me move forward. I would rather spend my remaining years building something good than spend any further portion of them monitoring the woman who tried to destroy what my father built. That, I think, is the real lesson buried inside the question of forgiveness. Sometimes the healthiest response isn't absolution, and it isn't ongoing anger either. It's simply turning your full attention toward the life and the people who actually deserve it. I want to close by speaking directly to you, whoever you are, wherever you are in your own version of this story. If you're the daughter watching a parent slowly disappear behind someone else's careful control, trust what you're seeing, even when you can't yet prove it, even when the people around you tell you you're overreacting. If you're the wife who has noticed accounts you no longer recognize, decisions being made without your knowledge, a partner who has started deferring every financial choice to someone whose interests may not actually align with your family's well-being, ask the hard questions now, while asking them still gives you options. If you're the sister trying to hold a fracturing family together across the particular strain that one manipulative outsider can cause, know that the relationships worth saving are almost always salvageable, even after years of distance and disagreement, once the truth finally becomes undeniable to everyone involved. If you're the stepdaughter fighting for a fair and honest accounting of a parent's true wishes, know that the law, slow and imperfect as it often is, does exist specifically to protect exactly the kind of legacy you're trying to preserve. And if you're the mother watching your own children navigate a blended family situation that doesn't feel right, trust that protective instinct as fiercely as you'd trust it in any other circumstance where your children's well-being was at stake. I spent 2 years of my life, alongside a brother and sister I love more than almost anything, fighting to make sure the truth about my father's final years was the truth that survived him, rather than the more convenient, more profitable story someone else tried to write in its place. It cost more than I ever expected it to cost. Financially, emotionally, in time I can never get back, and in a version of grief I never anticipated having to navigate. But I would make the exact same choice again, without hesitation, because the alternative, silence, acceptance, letting a lie stand simply because challenging it was exhausting, was never a version of peace I could actually live inside. My father spent 70 years building things that lasted. a business, a family, a reputation for honesty that meant something to everyone who ever shook his hand. In the end, the thing I'm proudest of isn't the money we recovered, or even the legal precedent our case may have helped establish for families facing similar situations. It's the fact that when everything was finally settled, when the dust of 2 years of fighting had cleared, the story that survived my father was the true one. A story of a generous, honest man who loved his children equally, whose actual final wishes were, in the end, exactly what he always said they would be. If you take nothing else from this story, take this. The truth is worth fighting for, however long that fight takes, however much it costs, and however uncertain the outcome may seem in the darkest, most exhausting middle of it. I promise you, from the other side of my own fight, that it is possible to come through something like this not just intact, but stronger, clearer, and more certain than ever of exactly who you are and exactly what you're willing to stand up and protect. My father taught me that, without ever meaning to teach me anything at all, simply by being the kind of man worth fighting for. I hope, whatever your own story looks like, you find exactly the same strength waiting for you on the other side of your own fight. Thank you truly for spending this time with me and with my father's story. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other.
Я думаю, там базову